Everyone can please take a seat.
See if we can make room over here. They had an extra chair.
Well, thank you for doing that.
Yeah, a little bit elbow room.
Makes it more comfortable.
Yeah. Okay, all I need is Jamila and Michelle.
Michelle's not here yet.
The chairman is, I gather.
That's Jamila. But that's not Jamila.
We could get everyone to sit, please. That would be great. So, thank you very much. You may sit anywhere you'd like.
No, I don't want to impose.
I think you can have anyone you want.
No. Okay, no worries.
Is Michelle here? No. So are you gonna? Perfect, great.
Well, good morning, advisory committee members, working group members, and members of the public joining us in the commission meeting room, online, and on the telephone. We're really, really happy that you all are able to find time in what is a very busy week to be with us here today for our November meeting of the Advisory Committee on Digital Empowerment and Diversity. And we are so pleased this morning to have with us our leader, Chairman Ajit Pai. And without any further ado, I'm going to turn the meeting over to him so that he can extend warm welcome to everyone. Good morning.
Well, good morning, and thank you so much, Jamila, for kicking us off this morning. And I apologize, I'm pretty under the weather is an understatement. Beneath the weather, I think, is a better way to put it. So I will try to get through this without coughing up a lung on all of you. But I want to thank once again Julia Johnson for taking on the role of the chair of the advisory committee in July of last year. She got us off to a good start, and then after she stepped down, I asked the illustrious Diane, sitting to my right, who was then the vice chair of the diversity committee, to assume the chair's role. And she's done just a spectacular job leading our group on some of these critical issues, from employment to broadcast ownership. And I also asked Anna Gomez, who I think is here. I saw her here a little literally. Oh, hey, Anna. I asked her to step into the role as vice chair, and agreed to this new leadership position. And together, Diane and Anna have been just a fantastic team, guiding this group with their expertise and their inclusive leadership style. So I want to take this time to thank each of them for assuming what is effectively a part-time job with little pay or no pay, I guess. No is probably the answer on that. But I also want to salute all of you who are working on these working groups that are really important. You know, when we were conceiving of the working groups, we had in mind for each of them a mission that we thought was important for the country. And I'm grateful to all of you for helping to fulfill that important mission. In particular, with the Broadcast Diversity and Development Working Group, you, of course, drafted some comprehensive comments for the FCC's Broadcast Incubator Program, and the report in order for which was adopted this past August. After some, 22 years, I think it was, of talking about it, we finally got it done. And I just hope it heralds the entry of women, minorities, and other disadvantaged populations into the broadcast ownership field, something that is sorely needed. And under the leadership of our Henry Rivera, former commissioner here at the FCC. The working group developed comments that helped shape the commission's program. So thank you for all the work you did in helping to get this program adopted. Not to be outdone, the Digital Empowerment and Inclusion Working Group also made some strides. They held a supplier diversity workshop at the FCC headquarters in June of 2018. Feels like it was just yesterday, but I was able to help start the event back in the summer, and you could tell from the crowd in the meeting room that it was successful, that you saw a bunch of folks, panelists who were participating and participants from across the country who were participating in one-on-one networking opportunities to try to get more information about contracting and employment. And I think, at least in coordination with the Office of Communications Business Opportunities and our very own Media Bureau, that workshop yielded real-time results for real people who are seeking opportunities to enter the field of communications. So in this regard, I want to thank Heather Gates and Rudy, who I see in front of me, and the entire working group for all the tremendous efforts here. Last but certainly not least, the Diversity in Tech Working Group has been very engaged in tackling the persistent lack of employment and business opportunity for women and minorities in the digital tech space. And this is something that I think, if anything, has become more keenly felt across the spectrum and across the country in the past several months since we stood up the working group. As you know, we tasked this working group with examining what we at the FCC can do to promote solutions and to identify best practices in hiring women and minorities. And this working group took the bull by the horns. They convened a roundtable in Silicon Valley with a number of chief executives and other officials from major high-tech firms in the United States. And I'm told that what they learned from this roundtable will form the basis of a best practices report that all of us can benefit from. I'm also told that additional roundtables may be convened to gather more data, and that is certainly something that I would encourage and I think is a positive step forward. So with respect to this group, my sincere thanks to Mark Morial. He'll always be his honor to me. Gavin Logan and Kathleen Abernathy, again a former commissioner here in these halls, for spearheading this vital initiative. That is pretty much all the vamping I had. I don't want to take away from the experts around the field, and I don't want to overstay my welcome, but want to thank all of our leaders for showing up on a Monday morning all chipper and unlike me, and I'll thank all of you for taking time away from your busy schedules and your families. I know it is a sacrifice to be in this mode of public service, but just know that your work is very much appreciated, and you're helping step by step, report by report, make this country a more diverse, inclusive place. And for that, I'm personally very grateful.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just allow me to say, on behalf of the Media Bureau staff, Michelle Carey, our fearless leader, and all of us who are doing this work of advisory committee, we so appreciate your support and attending these events and taking the time to check in on us and see how we're doing. So we thank you so much for being here today.
Happy to do it, and go Chiefs.
No.
I had to get that in there.
No.
So, as we said, we're very excited about today's agenda. I believe it reflects a tremendous amount of work on behalf of everyone associated with the advisory committee. We met last in March of this year, and you all set some pretty ambitious goals for yourself. And it's very gratifying to say that you've exceeded everyone's expectations. So today we'll be demonstrating and examining how diligent this group has been in assessing issues of broadcast ownership, universal broadband service, and equity in access to tech jobs. We're looking forward to a full and comprehensive meeting. And first of all, we want to thank our Vice Chair, Anna Gomez, and Wally Ryan for donating the coffee and the muffins, and for breakfast as well, and lunch. So thank you so much, Anna. That's really going to help to facilitate a smooth operation of the meeting. And we definitely want to thank all of the FCC staffers who worked so hard over the last several weeks to put this meeting together and make sure that everything went well. Our Deputy Designated Federal Officer, Brenda Villanueva, is joining us by phone this morning, so I'd like to turn to Brenda now for her remarks. Brenda?
Thank you, Jamila. Thank you. Good morning. Good morning, Chairman Pai, chairs and members of the Advisory Committee and Working Group. I just want to reiterate what Jamila said. I want to thank you all for your active participation during these last few months. It's been very, very busy since March. Some of you have traveled cross country, held extensive calls, organized gatherings, or produced extensive just to make sure that the advisory committee considered very important developments. So I look forward to today's presentations and active discussions. And I also want to thank the Media Bureau and other staff at the Commission for helping put together everything today. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. And now for her first official duties as the new Advisory Committee Chair, I turn the meeting over to Diane Sutter. Let's give Diane a warm welcome as she assumes the chair's role.
Thank you, Jamila. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We appreciate your being here. It means a lot to have your support for this. I have personally witnessed all the work that the members of these subcommittees have been doing, and they are diligent. And sometimes we have chairs, co-chairs that are taskmasters, I might add. So that the work that you will hear about this morning is the result of everyone around this room and those of you on the phone that have donated your time, your energies, and the support of your companies to do what I think is really something important, that is the reason we're all here, which is to make a difference in the industries that we represent, and hopefully to broaden those industries so that they more represent the communities that we all serve. And I am very pleased that you can be here. The things you're going to hear today, I think, show the work that's been done and also the work that is still left to be done, because we have a lot that's still on our plate, and each of the working groups, as you will hear, has work that they have concluded and work that they continue to work on as we move forward. I am thrilled to be joined by Anna today, and as our new vice chair, she has been an active participant with us, and I look forward to working with her as we continue to do the work that this committee has been asked to do. Anna, would you care to address the group?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thanks, Diane. First of all, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for appointing me to this position. I'd also like to say thank you to Michelle Carey for supporting me, and also thank you to Brenda and Jamila for all you do to keep us moving forward. Chairman Pai initially appointed me to the Digital Empowerment and Inclusion Working Group, and it's been a pleasure to serve with those members and as with the chair, Heather Gates, as well. I look forward to continuing to work with them on these important issues. I'm actually here representing the Hispanic National Bar Association. The Hispanic National Bar Association represents the interests of Hispanic legal professionals around the country, and also advocates on issues of importance to the 58 million people of Hispanic heritage that live in the United States. So I hope this committee continues to help identify and provide recommendations on ways to expand access to emerging technologies in all communities, including the Latino community, and to ensure everyone has equal opportunities to access these next generation networks and the opportunities that they present. In addition, I hope to continue to add to this committee, as well as to the working groups, my experiences based on my tenures both at the FCC and NTIA. I hope to leverage that knowledge that I gained at both agencies and to provide useful perspectives as we move forward. So thank you, Diane.
Thank you. All right, I think we're ready to call the meeting to order. So I would like to have the roll call of members. So if we have that list. We will do all the members that are present first, and then we'll ask for those that are participating by phone. Well, let me redo that, because they're in alphabetical order, which presupposes where you're sitting. So we will start that way. And we'll start with Kathleen Abernathy.
Here, I'm on the phone.
Thank you, Kathleen. Welcome. Susan Allen.
Thank you.
Present.
I know Maria Brennan is not with us. Rudy? Ron Busby? Victor Serta? Harian Contractor? Bridget Daniel? Jeanette Dates. Donna Epps.
Here.
Marita Coley.
Here.
Heather Gate.
Present.
David Honig.
Here.
Janice Howard. Dr. Ron Johnson.
Here.
Sherman Kizart.
Present.
Fatima Kotari. Mario Lopez. Mark Morial. Gavin Logan.
Here.
Monica Parham.
Present.
Henry Rivera.
Yes.
Alfredo Rodriguez. Brian Scarpelli.
Here.
Cindy Zhao. Maria Silva Dixon.
Present.
Shelley Blakeney. Dr. Nicole Turner Lee. James Winston. Jim's not here. Chris Wood. Okay. And is there anyone on the phone that I've missed? All right.
Steve Roberts is on the phone.
I beg your pardon?
Steve Roberts, Roberts Broadcasting is on the phone.
Thank you very much, Steve. All right. Now we're going to ask each of the working groups to give a report and share with us what they've been doing. And we will first hear from Heather Gate and her working committee, please. Okay. Heather?
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Chairman Pai.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Vice Chair, Commission staff, fellow committee members, and members of the public. I'm pleased to begin the Digital Empowerment and Inclusion Working Group's report by providing a brief summary of our working group's activities since we last met. Thereafter, each one of our subgroups will provide additional information on the work, on their activities over the last few months. During our last meeting in March, the committee unanimously voted to partner with FCC's Office of Communications Business Opportunity and the Media Bureau to host a supply diversity workshop, as Chairman Pai mentioned. Well, I'm happy to inform you that we did so successfully on the 4th of June. We hosted a very good event, and the details of that event will be, again, discussed a little bit later by subgroup members. So since we're celebrating Thanksgiving this week, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everybody that had a hand in making that event very successful. I'd like to express my appreciation and gratitude to the director of OCPO, Sanford Williams, who provided leadership and staff members that took the brunt of the planning activities and handling of logistics for that event. That their hard work was often behind the scene and instrumental in making the event a success and should not go unnoticed. I would also like to thank Michelle Carey and the Media Bureau staff that also put in their time and talent to make that event successful. I'd like to recognize Gavin Logan, who joined us from the Diversity in Tech Working Group and joined our meetings and helped us brainstorm and think through ideas of attracting different stakeholders in the technology sector. So thank you, Gavin. I would like to also recognize the working group and committee members that helped to put together a robust agenda and make sure that the event was stacked with speakers and panelists that were critical, again, to making the event successful. More importantly, they made sure that small and diverse entrepreneurs that were in attendance were left equipped with new insights on navigating corporate supply diversity. programs, working with corporate procurement offices, and having gained new leads in contracting opportunities that are pivotal to sustained growth and investment in diverse communities. So I would really like to take a moment to recognize my Access subgroup led by Rudy that worked really hard to make this happen. So thank you, Rudy, with the Comcast, and Donna that played a critical role in getting us started in even drafting our goals and objectives around the Supply Diversity event. I also wanted to recognize Susan Allen that used her expertise, networks, and contacts with the U.S. Pan-Asian American Chamber of Commerce to make sure we had some rock stars in the panel of experts that met with our group. Other people within that subgroup I want to recognize that also helped us secure some quality speakers include Laura Buracle with Charter Communications, Janice Brian Hoyard with Act One, Marie Celia Dixon with T-Mobile, Nicole Lee Turner with Brookings Institute, and Esther Trigg, who's representing the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association. So thank you all for really stepping up and making sure that we achieve the goals that we set out to achieve. Lastly, I would like to thank Chairman Pai for taking time to attend the event and demonstrate his support for the important work that this committee is doing. Not only did he come to provide remarks, but he came to network and be with us prior to the event getting kicked off that day. So again, thanks to everybody that contributed to making that event a success. And you'll hear more about the specific details a little bit later. So in addition to hosting the Supply Diversity event, under our adoption subgroup, we have been engaged with meeting with a diverse range of digital divide scholars as part of our fact-finding mission as we seek to define and explore the critical factors contributing or narrowing digital disparities. While we met with some scholars over the summer, we continue to work on this and we'll continue to do this for the next few months. As far as the experts that we met with, we had 3 critical questions that we addressed with them. We asked them to share what they know or don't know about the digital divide. We asked them to discuss the roadblocks and barriers that exist for unserved and underserved communities, and what policies and programs are working or not working within those communities. We also asked them to share or recommend scholarly and policy papers that offer recommendations or solutions for narrowing the digital divide and promoting digital equity. So later on, Chris Wood will talk a little bit more about our initial observations and findings from those discussions. Ultimately, the goal of these ongoing engagements is for the subgroup members to gain clarity on actual and perceived issues that affect the ability for both individuals and online to participate in the digital economy. The information gathered will be used to develop the most appropriate policy solutions, best practices, and explore new ideas for advancing digital inclusion. And the role that the FCC can play in those endeavors. So for us, the work continues, and the goal is for us to make recommendations around this work by May 2019. So for now, I would like to hand the floor over to Rudy Brioche to lead the Access subgroup update. And Rudy, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Heather. And let me just reiterate my appreciation to everyone who's been part of this process. It indeed, took a village to make this a successful event. What we'll do is we will go through the presentation. I'll rely on some of our subject matter experts to highlight some of the features of the Supplier Diversity Workshop. discussing the milestones, the goals of the workshop, and then we will review the outcomes, because the intention was to make sure that this workshop was one that actually produced results. We'll discuss some of the outcomes, and then finally we'll go through a recommendation that this subgroup is prepared to make to the full committee to discuss how we can memorialize some of our lessons learned and to hopefully implement some of the suggestions we have. And again, we'll take any amendments or questions from other members of the committee as well. Susan Allen will give the opening goals of our event, and then following by that, Janelle Trigg will discuss the outcomes, and then Laura will discuss some of the recommendations as well. So, Susan?
Thank you, Rudy. I'm just privileged to have the opportunity to work with this group and start with planning and preparing, organizing the workshop on supply diversity in June. We had 3 goals that were set out for us. We wanted to facilitate sharing information about short and long-term private sector business opportunities for small and diverse businesses. That's goal number 1. Goal number 2 was to educate small and diverse suppliers on how to navigate corporate supply diversity programs. And goal number 3 was to enable networking between corporations and workshop participants during June 4th to increase awareness about the nature of the supply services available to corporations, as well as the contracting opportunities that suppliers could access and try to win on. To fulfill these goals, we came up with a program that consists of 4 components: 3 panelist presentations, 1 one-on-one private consultation. And through these 4 components, we succeeded in achieving our goals at the start. We had the panel 1, a group of corporation supply diversity managers who are committed to keeping the door open for diverse suppliers in the future opportunities that will be available, particularly when we look at the investment in infrastructure. They also shared about how small and diverse businesses need to do in order to be competitive and qualified to do business with their corporations. Panel number 2 presented the successful diverse suppliers, and they shared their stories from the bottom to the top, how they overcome trials and tribulations, and how they find tips and successful strategies and get them to the very top and win the goal. It was very motivational and inspirational, truly empowering, and contributing to the FCC's mission and policy to try to empower the disadvantaged communities to get involved in the mainstream process of procurement, particularly in the forthcoming digital and video programming that we are here to talk about. Panel number 3 consists of corporations who will talk about, let me see, I am a little bit off here. Panel number 3 consists of the toolbox, where organizations like such as ours, the U.S. Pan-Asian American Chamber of Commerce, the Women Business National Enterprise Council, the Small Business Administration, the National Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce, they all come together to talk about how their respective organizations work together to bring procurement opportunities and information and education to this very diverse community. And finally, we have the one-on-one private consultation. I must say that this is successful because of the diversity this workshop represents. We have African American, Hispanic, Native American, Asian American women, LGBT, government from a federal and local level. It was an all-in-all a win-win workshop, and I must salute the FCC for taking this big step forward, and I look forward to working with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Rudy, thank you. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
I'm delighted, too, to be a member of this planning team, particularly since we developed a comprehensive agenda and facilitated a successful event in less than 3 months. The event, as Susan said, had significant attendance by our target audience, very diverse panelists. And our total attendance was about 60 people. The presentations of the panelists and the moderators met all of our objectives. They were very diverse, as Susan mentioned, trade associations, different sizes, experience, as well as from different geographic areas. That was also one of our goals. The panelists also, I think very importantly, focused on sharing information and anecdotes that were not just for small and diverse businesses, but also could apply to any business on Main Street, particularly new entrants. Approximately 40 small businesses and their representatives participated in the one-on-one networking sessions. There were also business consultations with many of the businesses that participated as panelists as well. And there are quite a few that traveled a great distance just to be here, some from Chicago as well as Nebraska. We also conducted some informal feedback from both the panelists as well as the attendees, and everyone had positive things to say, and certainly want us to continue doing this type of workshop. Thank you.
Great, well, thank you very much. Before we turn to the recommendation of the sub-working group, any other comments from any members of the working group? Okay, so now we'll turn to the actual recommendation. In making these recommendations, the sub-working group considered a number of factors. One, what was in fact achievable. It's important for us to develop goals and objectives that are in fact measurable and doable. So we decided to look at these recommendations as steps that the commission, along with the private sector, can take in a very meaningful way. Secondarily, we wanted to make sure that we had recommendations that will have some kind of impact. Based on discussions with members who participated in the workshop, there were certain gaps, certain areas they thought that we can improve upon, not just for the next workshop, but for years to come. And that leads us to the last point, which is sustaining. The recommendations ought to be objectives that would have some type of sustaining impact on the affected communities. So that's the guide and principles that we used in developing the recommendations. Laura will go through the recommendations, and then we'll open it up for a broader discussion.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Is this on?
Yes.
Okay, great. So it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. We're really excited to be able to share our recommendation with the full committee. You know, as you've heard fellow members discuss the supplier diversity workshop and what we were able to achieve with that, I think the biggest benefit is really being able to bring together some of these diverse suppliers and give them an opportunity to really network with not only each other, but also with regulators here and with industry. Charter was one of the companies that participated in the supplier diversity workshop, and it really serves as an opportunity to not only educate these suppliers on our opportunities and other business opportunities, but it really gives an opportunity for some of these companies, these smaller businesses, to build a network and to be able to know where they can go to get the information that they need. So with that said, our recommendation is that through the Office of Communications and Business Opportunities, that we continue to host this workshop on an annual basis. And also OCBO would be, our recommendation would be that they also cooperate with the pertinent FCC bureaus and offices to implement what the workshop would look like, what the details of the workshop would entail each year. Not to say there would be a cookie cutter approach necessarily, but the takeaway is really for this to continue to happen with the FCC because it served a really good purpose this year, and we hope to see it continue throughout the years to come. Some of the areas where the workshop could focus on and what it would achieve is essentially networking opportunity and an opportunity to share information regarding supplier services that are available. It also serves, as I said, as an education and information resource for diverse businesses. And it also fosters a better understanding of the challenges that face small and diverse businesses for industry, as well as a better understanding of how to navigate government and corporate supplier programs. So with that said, one of the other pieces that we wanted to incorporate in our recommendation includes developing a contact database. So as we host these events, it's important to keep track of which diverse companies are attending, right? So we have kind of a list of companies that we can call on when we host additional events in upcoming years. It's also important to know who are the companies that, the larger corporations that participated, who are the diverse suppliers that participated, who are the government agencies that were participating, if it's this, Small Business Administration or other agencies. It's important to have a list that we can kind of call to and go to, so that it's a step and repeat in terms of when we host another event, we have somewhere to start, and we're not just starting from scratch each year. So that was one piece of the recommendation that's tied to the supplier diversity workshop. So if there's any questions about the workshop, I can continue through with the 2 additional recommendations that are noted in your handouts. No additional questions? Okay. Okay, so our working group further recommends that the commission consider 2 additional proposals. One of them is really an opportunity for the FCC to also serve as an information resource for the private sector. So currently, the FCC has a contracting and procurement information page on their fcc.gov website. And while that information enables visitors to the website to be directed to opportunities within the federal government for supplier diversity and procurement, we thought it would be beneficial to also have the FCC include, and this would be discussed with the working group on how this would look, but information regarding the distinct supplier diversity programs that are managed through different companies. So larger companies, including many of the companies that are part of this working group and this full committee, their information could be housed on the FCC's page as well, and direct visitors to the websites that provide more information about, for example, a company like ours, our supplier diversity program. Oftentimes for some of these small diverse businesses, it's challenging for them to navigate hundreds of companies and understand what their supplier diversity programs look like and what they require or where to go to get information. So we think the FCC would serve as a good one-stop shop kind of online resource for small diverse businesses to be able to go there and say, oh, if I'm looking for information about a specific company, the FCC could be a good resource to be able to access that information. The second proposal is really dealing more with an online portal. So I welcome input from my fellow members as well, because this is a more ambitious proposal. But essentially, the portal would enable the commission to expand outside of the federal sector and better serve the public interest by acting as a disseminator of information for the technology and telecommunications industry, and a one-stop information resource to diverse suppliers that are not only seeking opportunities for procurement opportunities specifically within government, but also with private sector organizations. So as you can see here, it's a longer recommendation, but there may be such online portals that exist with other agencies. So our recommendation is for the Office of Communications and Business Opportunities to explore what's already out there, what existing portals exist with other agencies, and determine if there's an opportunity to work in collaboration with these agencies to be able to develop a portal that also includes opportunities for the private sector. So for example, if there's a way for us to include information that showcases not only what larger companies, like a company like Charter offers, but also larger suppliers, because oftentimes there's larger suppliers that are looking for small, really, really small, diverse and small businesses to help them meet the needs of what they need to fulfill for contracts, whether it's federal contract or whether it's private sector opportunities or private contracts that they have with companies. So that's in a nutshell, our recommendation. If I've missed anything, because there's better experts than me in this room on this issue, so I welcome other members to provide feedback if you feel I've missed anything.
No,
But
Lori,
thank you.
You've done an outstanding job. Before we get into a broader discussion here and some comments, Any other members of this group would like to add in on these recommendations, comments? These recommendations were really thoroughly discussed within the working group. As you can tell, we have a quite lively bunch. A lot of ideas were packed into it. Just want to highlight a couple things that in the recommendation, we specifically reference existing and next generation network and technologies. The intention behind that language is to ensure that the Commission approaches this with a wider lens. In light of the work that Gavin and others has done in their working group, it's important for us to build upon that work. And so the supply diversity workshop should be viewed as not only addressing regulated entities of existing networks, but also entities that may not be regulated in the space, but clearly are part of the broader national discussion and technology development in the future. So from that standpoint, we did make an aggressive effort, particularly through the work that Gavin and others had done to reach out to primarily technology companies, many of whom expressed an interest in being part of this process. But they have to be part of the process at the ground floor to ensure that this is a approach that would implicate all companies across the board, not only the companies that are generally before you at the Commission. The other is that it's important that the highlights that Heather made as far as how do we improve the information sharing, the information sharing mechanisms within the Commission. Information needs to be pushed out to small, minority, diverse, women-owned businesses. Having a centralized portal is clearly an approach that would be very helpful. It's one that we recognize will take some time because it always takes time to get these things done, whether in the private sector or at the FCC, but it ought to be a goal. And we think that there are enough resources out there currently online that to the extent that we can pull all those together, that would facilitate a better sense of information sharing and a better sense of how do we actually expand upon what is currently there. So we don't duplicate efforts, we build and take and we benefit from what already exists and have a better sense of what we need to do in the future. So we very much see this portal as a way of sharing information and yet at the same time helping to inform the government and the private sector of how we can help fill gaps moving forward. So one other thing we'd like to add. Yep, please.
Just one additional point. So there was an additional recommendation that had been made that, as I understand, hasn't made it to the printed version. So I'd like to just read that out loud so you all know that this is also part of the recommendation. We completed the recommendation stating that the Diversity, Digital Empowerment and Inclusion Working Group recommends that the Office of Communications and Business Opportunities coordinate with the full committee on any action related to the implementation of this recommendation. And I just think that that's a really important point that all of the members of this committee should recognize, simply because as we present this recommendation to the Commission, we also want to be part of the implementation process and understanding, what are the decisions that OCBO is making around developing, designing, and implementing these recommendations. So I feel like it's important for us to ensure that we have a voice and a seat at the table when those negotiations are happening.
And not just OCBO, but any involved bureau or office.
Rudy,
So thank you very much for that. Yep.
can I just make a comment on the e-portal that has been just suggested? I think I would suggest that we, consistent with the FCC's policy to try to reach out to the underserved community, the e-portal will focus on industries such as the media, digital news and information, and audio and video programming industries. Because if we were to be so ambitious as to try to create an e-portal that pose opportunities from other corporations and agencies, it will be an overwhelming task. We can focus our posting of opportunities and information that is zeroed in on the industry that FCC is seriously interested. It would be a much easier task and more focused because the world is very big out there for what we're trying to do in procurement opportunities.
For sure. And I think that's why we settled on the language of existing and next generation networks and technologies. It is a wide sea, but again, you have to deal first with the low hanging fruit, but also recognizes that there are other opportunities out there that will need to be part of this process. I understand that. So, Heather, thank you very much. Laura, thank you very much for making that one amendment to the language that you have before you, where the working group recommends that OCBO coordinate with the committee on any action related to implementing these recommendations. That is the current list of recommendations, but I do understand that the Honorable David Honig also has some comments and possibly another recommendation as well.
Rudy, just to clarify then, would you like it to be amended to include the FCC coordinate, so that would include OCBO and any other entity inside? So we would say that the FCC will coordinate with the full committee on any action related to implementation of the proposals?
Yes.
Would that be the appropriate amendment to this? All right, great. And would you like to move that the committee consider that then, please, this proposal?
I would. I hereby move that the committee considers that amendment as modified.
And do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you. I'd like to open the floor for discussion.
On this
David?
particular amendment?
If I could, I'd like to thank you for offering me a couple of minutes to provide some context. Sometimes we forget why we're here, and I'd like to just offer a couple moments of just why we're here, this elephant in the room, talking about procurement today. It's such a privilege to be in the presence of representatives of large companies whose procurement policies and practices are exemplary. Rudy, your company, and Laura's company, and Donna's company, Marie's company operate some of the best procurement programs in any industry in the nation. And sometimes we forget, because we live in this great bubble, that not all companies operate the way yours do. That there are those who still operate the way in 30, 40, 50 years ago most companies in our industries operated, which was just the old boy network. The way that you learned about procurement opportunities was that you learned about it from your friends who already had these opportunities. And by the time major contracts were let, if you were a minority or woman-owned company, you never heard about them. The answer to that was found in the cable industry in 1992 in the Cable Act, thanks to Congressman Towns and Congressman Rush, in the Cable Procurement Act, which became the Cable Procurement Rule when it was implemented to the Commission, which simply provided that if you were a cable company regulated by the Commission, you had to use broad recruitment. You had to put out an RFP so that everyone would hear about the opportunity. This was so non-controversial that it led to no litigation, no complaints, favorably viewed as a concept by every Supreme Court justice who's passed on it, including notably Justice Scalia in the Croson case in 1989, previous to this, in Richmond, Virginia. The commission has had no commissioners object to it, and it's produced millions of dollars in opportunity just due to minority and women contractors hearing about the opportunity to bid, to lay cable, and so forth. Now, without going into too much detail in the weeds, unfortunately, the matter is in court over an issue as to whether this very successful cable procurement rule should be expanded to broadcasting, wireless, and wireline. There are no opponents to this rule. All of the trade organizations in those industries have not opposed the extension of the cable rule to their industries. 4 former chairs wrote to the previous former chair saying, please do this, it's your legacy. All of the minority representatives of the Commerce Committee endorsed it. 57 national organizations endorsed it. The previous Advisory Committee on Diversity endorsed it unanimously. And yet, here it is in court the second time now by MMTC and NABOB. So, wanting to be sure that everyone knew about that, but not wanting to embroil this advisory committee in that litigation. I'm very concerned that adoption of this recommendation could unfortunately be misconstrued as an endorsement of workshops and portals, much as we need them. And there's nothing in the resolution that is objectionable. It's all admirable. As a substitute for the extension of the cable procurement rule to other industries. So I'd like to offer the following language as language not to be changing the resolution, but in transmission of it to the Commission, that in transmitting the recommendation to the Commission, the body state that it does not intend to suggest that the steps contained in the recommendation are a substitute for the relief sought by MMTC and NABOB in their proposal that the Commission extend the cable procurement rule to other industries, including broadcasting and telecom. And I'd be glad to take questions if there are any questions about how this would work.
Well, David, thank you. Before we address your specific language, can we close out the motion? I think there's a motion on the table on the amendment to the recommendation. Would like to ensure that that was actually added to the body of the recommendation itself.
All right, let me go back and ask then, is the recommendation you have suggested that includes all three of those things? So we are just clarifying, when you made your motion included that FCC will coordinate with the full committee action, so that we are now actually in discussion on the full recommendation that would include that.
Exactly, to the text of the
Yes.
recommendation. Which
So
does not
just to
include-
clarify
yeah.
with everyone, what we're discussing now is the proposal that has been suggested and put forth to the full committee to accept, which does include that language.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
Now, David, are you offering an amendment to their proposed recommendation?
The amendment is actually an amendment to what is being voted on, but not to the text of the recommendation. It is an amendment, the nature of which is to the language of transmittal, that in the cover letter that would transmit the recommendation to the Commission, that cover letter would simply state that that the vote adopting the recommendation should not be read as suggesting that the steps in the recommendation are a substitute for the relief sought by MMTC and NABOB
I have a
to
question.
extend to other industries.
I have a question.
Yes,
So
Chairman.
So my question to David and to you, Madam Chair, is before the motion that's currently
On the floor.
that's been proposed, that this is their discussion before the motion is adopted. Is that kind of where we are?
That's where we are at the moment.
So before the motion is adopted by the full committee, there has to be I guess, the determination based on David's revision to, David, would you seeking a revision to their motion? Is that?
No, no, this is just language that would go in the letter of transmittal.
All right, then in fact, I think what we can do is have a discussion around the motion as it stands. And then we can have a discussion that discusses whether or not we add to that the transmittal language. So if I can go back to the motion that is on the floor that includes the recommendations that you all have in your packet, with the addition that the FCC coordinate with the full diversity committee any action on implementation of the recommendations. And is there any further discussion on the proposal that's before us?
Yes.
Yes, please, Henry.
It's just this notion of the commission coordinating with the committee, I think needs to take into account that this committee is finite. I mean, our charter expires in July or June 30, so I don't know what the commission or OCBO, who they're going to coordinate with if this committee doesn't exist. So somehow that needs to, you all need to think about how that's going to work.
Well, you know, actually we did, and we thought that was kind of outside of our control, because to the extent that the charter is extended or not is one that we can't really decide upon. But you're right, to the extent that we exist, the commission would coordinate, but to the extent we don't exist, the commission would not coordinate.
Well, maybe that needs to be added. to the, some language like that. I don't have it, maybe you want to think about it before.
During the duration of the committee's charter.
Maybe during the existence of this and future diversity.
Sure.
Which would
Committees, right?
cover the broader scope of, if there is a reconstituted diversity committee, that committee would also be consulted?
But, well, that would be fine. It's just, again, just conceptually.
Just recognizing the
you'd
fact
have a
that this
huge-
is a,
Like, this committee, its predecessor expired 2 or 3 years ago. So there was this hiatus of several years.
when there was no committee.
Right. So I just don't know how meaningful this would be. And, I mean,
Well, at the very least, I think it indicates intent, which
Yeah,
is,
that's-
which is what I gather is the goal. But I appreciate Henry's comment, because, again, we are chartered at the pleasure of the chair at any given time, this or any previous committee, nor for any committee going forward. So perhaps, Rudy, is there some slight adjustment you would like to make in that takes that into account? Or are you comfortable that this speaks as you would like it to be?
I think maybe we can add this diversity committee or any future. Maybe that modification would address that issue.
Question. If indeed there is no future diversity committee, would we like for the commission to engage with diverse private sector members in planning and implementation of the workshop? So that way it's more inclusive? If there's no formal diversity committee, do we want to still be engaged in that process, or is that something outside of?
I would think that it would be literally impossible, I think it'd be literally impossible for the commission to in fact host a supplier diversity workshop without coordination with the private sector and other stakeholders.
Okay, so we don't need to say that in here?
I don't think it's necessary.
Okay? Thanks.
The commission has an OPPO. OPPO had done that before, had done a supply diversity workshop before, except that it was not to the extent and success that we have done. So I think we ought to really step on this platform of success we have created and put language in it so that we'll be assured. There's a lot of what we call legislative history, and as you said, the intent. We got to plan that language there so that whether it will go into another hiatus or it will be renewed next year, we will have that language there. It will be in the history of this, the work of the commission. And it does have OCPO. OCPO is charged with that job, except it was not, they didn't do as well because it did not have this committee to
support.
help
The
to support
support
and
of the-
push it up.
I think that's the intention behind the very recommendation itself,
So-
is to clearly make that point. I think we're making it in a pretty significant way, considering the detail that we've included in the recommendation. But there's no question, I think that there are explicit and implicit statements included in the recommendation. The explicit statements are on their face, as far as the commission ought to continue having an annual workshop. That workshop requires the commission to interact with private sector, particular owners, operators of existing and future and next generation networks and technologies. The commission ought to look for different ways to improve upon its information sharing, both on its website as far as maintaining a contact database and developing this portal. And then on top of that, I think the last statements as far as just this ongoing coordination with this or any other iterations of the diversity
Of the diversity committee.
I think those are the explicit, and I think by that sends a very strong message from an implicit standpoint that this requires close coordination with the private sector and other stakeholders. in
And
those
certainly, they
aspects.
saw the success that came from the inclusion of the diversity committee, or at the recommendation of the diversity committee, really, to
Yep.
have this happen. Susan, yes.
I also like David's suggestion, and I would like to see if we could, if at all, add what the sentiment in this recommendation as well.
Yeah,
I know
remember
that he
what
wanted it
David's-
to be in transmittal, but I like it to be part of, express that sentiment in these recommendations. I really like that, David.
So, Madam Chair, at this point, I'd like to move for a vote on
Wanna call the question?
on the existing.
May I just read this over again? Because we'll send this out. I really want to make sure this wording is what you all intended to be. The third prong of your recommendation is that the ACDDE recommends that the FCC coordinate with this advisory committee or any successor diversity committee on implementation, on any action related to implementation of this recommendation.
Should be these recommendations.
These recommendations.
These recommendations. Thank you.
All right. Let's call the question, if we can, please, on this recommendation as we have it, the three pieces. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? By unanimous consent, this group has taken this on then as a recommendation that we will pass on to the commission. Now, in terms of David's comments on transmittal, David, your recommendation would be, please?
The advisory committee, and I just emailed you the language, in transmitting this recommendation to the commission, would state that it does not intend to suggest that the steps contained in the recommendation are a substitute for the relief sought by MMTC and NABOB in their proposal that the commission extend the cable procurement rule to other industries, including broadcasting and telecom.
Can we, is that something you'd like to move to the group?
Yes, I so move.
All right, did we have a second for that?
Second.
Henry? All right, so. All right, discussion, please. Susan, you would like to have that, would you like to speak to that?
No, I like that. This is the first time I hear about it, but I thought this is a great idea. But I just like to not propose this as a negative. Instead of saying does not intend, why don't you just put in a more positive motion? State.
I actually worded it as do not intend to suggest to do it in the narrowest possible way. I wouldn't object if we wanted to say that it does intend to suggest that it's not a substitute, but I'm agreeable to having it done either way.
Well, because I don't have the language in front of me, it's hard for me to edit it, but
Yes, Rudy?
Yeah, there is a challenge as far as not having the language, but to the extent that it could be simplified as well, would be helpful, because I think there's a lot of verbiage towards the end that may not be necessary.
It could be, it doesn't need to specifically make reference to the parties. It could be just said, does not intend to suggest that the steps contained in the recommendation are a substitute for extending the cable procurement rule to other industries. That would do it.
And does that accomplish the goal, or is there still any question or need for other revision on the language? Laura?
I have a question. So in the language where you're saying our recommendation wouldn't be a substitute for the cable procurement rule, is it an endorsement by the committee to pursue exactly what the language that would be in the transmittal?
I was actually trying to word it as narrowly because I thought that some of the representatives here might need to get a corporate approval to make it an affirmative. That came up when we had the 2004 committee voted for it, and some companies, some representatives did have to get corporate approval. They got it, and they voted for it unanimously. But that was why I worded it as a negative, because I thought that everyone would have the ability to vote for that vote for it as written this way.
So it wouldn't be language that indicates that the full committee would endorse?
Yeah, this
necessarily
would
what you're-
accomplish the
this would just-
objective in the narrowest possible way.
Okay, thank you.
So it's been moved and seconded.
Are there other questions or comments?
I would just say
Yes, Donna?
that certainly wasn't the intent, and so I think the very narrow construction would be appropriate.
So to reword this, does not intend to suggest that the steps contained in the recommendation are a substitute for extending the cable procurement rule to
Would it
other
be simpler
industries.
just to say that these recommendations do not substitute as an extension of the cable procurement rule to broadcast and telecommunications industries?
To other industries.
To other industries, just plain and simple. They do not substitute these recommendations.
David, would you be open to that as an amendment? Or as a reconstitution of your amendment?
These recommendations
Do not substitute. And then the rest would continue.
do not substitute for extending the cable. So it would say, should state that these recommendations
Do not substitute as an extension of the cable procurement rule to broadcast or other industries.
Would that be acceptable, David? And just to make sure, if anyone on the, that's listening on the phone has comments, please feel free to speak up.
Janelle, I'm going to send this to you too.
Yeah, can you send it around, because David, one of the areas of concern is to the extent you can broaden it, because as you can imagine, this is layered with quite a bit of history and quite a bit of back and forth. This is a pending lawsuit, is my understanding, between MMTC and NABOB against the commission.
Yeah.
Um,
So I should go all
It's,
that out.
it's,
Janelle, it's on its way to you. And Ruby,
okay.
take a quick look and see if we've got it. I think Janelle's formulation is probably closest.
Maybe something broad like this language should not be construed for any pending legal action? Or just leave it very broad in general?
But if we say expressly that this does not substitute, period.
Yeah, but the problem, though, is that we are weighing in specifically on an ongoing litigation. And I think that we need to make this a lot broader, so it's not us weighing in one way or another in terms of a substitute or not for any specific piece of ongoing litigation.
Madam Chair, does that require this
Is there any chance
motion to be
that we can
removed, or?
circulate
No, I think
something?
we're close enough.
Well, I
Or-
think what we need to do is first get language clarity.
Yes.
And then everyone can decide how they want to vote once we have the clarity of the language. So
Thank
Because
I
there
think
clearly
David
seems to
and-
be some strong concerns as I'm
which is why
listening to it.
we will call the question, and the group's pleasure will be one we'll rely
Madam
on.
Chair, maybe I could recommend that maybe, David and I and a handful of other people can work on language and then propose it to the committee, as opposed to taking up the time now to do that, right?
After lunch.
And we're happy to make copies if you want to email something, and then everyone can have the language in front of them if you want to table this until
All right,
maybe the afternoon broadcast report.
Yeah.
all right. If David, if you're open to that, would you allow us to table that until we've had a chance to see specific language, and then we can have more conversation if necessary before we take any vote on it?
Okay.
Sure.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. All right. Excuse me.
So, Madam Chair, I know that we were ahead of schedule. We've now put you back on schedule by taking up the extra time. So, thank you very much for that. So now, the next part of the sub-working group's presentation will focus on the next step. The next item we're focusing on is one concerning the access portion of our discussions, and that would be led by the co-chair of the sub-working group, Donna Epps. followed by a brief presentation by Nicole Turner-Lee from Brookings and S. Janelle Trigg, representing the Internet Service Provider Association. The presentation of the subworking group will be closed by a presentation by the co-chair of the full committee, Anna Gomez.
Good morning, everyone. Such a privilege to be here and to serve on this sub-working group of so many talented individuals. I want to also add my thanks to Heather and Rudy for their fearless leadership and shepherding us through these very important issues. I know it's a little bit like herding cats sometimes, but I think the collaboration has yielded some really positive results. So I want to talk a little bit about where we go from here. We certainly want to build on the success that we have had in the supplier diversity area, but as Rudy said, we want to focus on the access portion of our sub-working group's charter, and want to look at two things. As we all know, when Chairman Pai kicked off this committee, he asked us to look at digital redlining and digital inclusion. He made it clear that he wanted to make sure that there were no commission rules standing in the way of ensuring that all communities are served with next-generation technologies and broadband services. So in that regard, our next work stream will focus on two areas that are really focused, geared towards making sure that there are no barriers to access to technology for under-resourced communities, low-income communities, communities of color. The first piece of that, which Dr. Nicole Turner-Lee will expound on, will look at this concept of digital redlining and digital inclusion, and we'll do two things. First, try to get our arms around exactly what that concept is from a definitional standpoint, and secondly, focus on developing some best practices that all parties could pursue to try to avoid any inadvertent exclusion of under-resourced communities, all parties including not just industry, but state and local government officials, obviously federal officials as well, but also community grassroots organizations that know their communities well. The second piece of the work stream will focus on how do we target the very limited funds that we have to provide support to building out broadband in hard-to-serve communities, and with a specific focus on ensuring that we do not engage in overbuilding, which is a particular concern for small minority and women-owned network providers who already have a lot of difficulties accessing capital, and S. Janelle Trigg will expound on the work stream in that regard. So with that, let me turn it over to Dr. Nicole Turner-Lee.
Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Chairwoman, Co-Chairwoman, for the time. Heather, our subgroup leader, as well as Rudy, our co-chair of this particular committee. So what we basically want to just say today is we're not putting a particular recommendation on the floor. What we're just suggesting is that we're going to go through a state of inquiry and exploration on what redlining is. The chairman has made some comments in addition to this committee. We've heard him on NPR Marketplace define digital redlining as a notion that within a certain geographic area, a company might have a business case for building out in areas A, B, and C. But in the area D, they simply say they're not going to deploy there because we don't see a return on investment or for whatever reason. We feel as a committee that this particular larger advisory committee has a purpose to look at the issue of redlining from a regulatory perspective, because redlining presents a major roadblock standing in the way of universal access to telecommunications services. And it also walls off the ability of certain citizens of this country to be first-class digital citizens. And that is a problem that I think all of us in this committee could actually see worth exploration, because fencing off lower income communities and disproportionately affecting people of color does not do anything to advance the mission of broadband universally. And so what does that mean? In our exploration of this issue from the very high level, helicopter level, we found that there's really not a good working definition of redlining. So we have to start from the basics and start from scratch. And so we hope to develop as a subgroup a set of core definitions of what is actually on record as redlining being defined. There are some things that are on record with regards to the FCC in terms of its statutory authority. We will explore that. We also hope to come up with definitions from potentially industry who are well represented on this committee, in addition to civic leaders or civil society who are engaging this issue within their particular neighborhoods and communities. Our hope is out of that to come up with a set of principles or best practices that may assist in sort of helping to ensure that we do not see this become something further entrenched in the deployment of broadband services. And our hope is, where necessary, we definitely will recommend some policy strategies and solutions. Chairwoman, that would not come till later. We wanted to put it on record that we have an intent to explore this issue. And I'll pass it over to Janelle Trigg, who has started to think through one aspect that could potentially be related to redlining, which is around overbuilding, and overbuilding in ways that you bypass communities which are in desperate need of incentives as well as broadband investments. So I will leave it right there. Donna, co-chair, I think that's all I need to say.
Okay.
All right, and turn over to Janelle.
Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Nicole. It's no secret that today the gap between the digital haves and the have-nots is still abysmal. Significantly, the digital divide exists in all geographic areas, including tribal lands, although the biggest, of course, is in rural areas and tribal lands. But this divide also cuts across all races and ethnicities. For this reason, there is universal, and I'm very proud to say bipartisan support to accelerate broadband deployment, as evidenced by the many state and federal government programs that provide incentives such as loans and grants to build facilities-based high-speed networks across the country. But there should also be a universal goal of ensuring that these scarce taxpayer dollars are used in an effective and prudent manner, as well as ensuring that new entrants that are trying to reach these unserved and hard-to-serve areas, such as small and diverse businesses, are not facing any additional market entry barriers or obstacles to growth. Therefore, that's why there's the need to prevent overbuilding, funded by government funds, public money. And that's to make sure that construction that's designated in areas that already have sufficient access to broadband or are scheduled to receive broadband access through the many government programs such as the FCC's Connect America Fund, $1.4 billion, NTIA's BTOP program, or the Rural Utility Services many programs, including the upcoming $600 million e-connectivity pilot program for broadband. We want to make sure that that money is spent in the areas that need it the most. Those are areas, communities across the country that have no G, much less than 5G, that don't have broadband service at all, or certainly broadband service that is below 10 megahertz down or 1 up. So our objective is to ensure that government-supported overbuilding does not happen, or at least lay some principles that you can prevent such overbuilding. There must be coordinated efforts between all the stakeholders, and that includes the FCC, NTIA, Department of Agriculture, states, municipalities, counties, industry, all stakeholders, to make sure that this is a coordinated effort. So we recommend that we develop general principles, not particular to any one program or any particular government entity, that helps to prevent government funding overbuilding, so we can ensure that taxpayer money is used the most effective way, the most expedient way, and the most successful way to make sure that all Americans are connected to the digital divide, or connected to the digital economy, and don't suffer from the digital divide. Thank you.
That concludes the sort of readout and roadmap as to where the access subgroup will be going in the coming months. So turn it over to you for the other subgroups, Heather.
Thank you, Donna, and thank you, members of the Access Subgroup, for all the tremendous
Madam
work.
Chairwoman?
For all the great work that you've done.
Excuse me just a second. Yes?
This is Hareen Contractor. My apologies for being late. We had 2 children. I had to go to the emergency room this morning, being sick. I am on now.
Well, welcome. We're glad to have you. Thank you.
Well, maybe I'll take this moment, if I can just say one thing, and folks on the committee, on the subwork group have known that I've raised this every time, but I just wanted to point out that NTIA has done some great work in the area of digital inclusion. And so I'm hoping as we move forward that we recognize their work and that we benefit from their experience and expertise, starting with Broadband USA, which is a initiative that NTIA undertook to basically take the lessons that it's learned over the many years of providing funding and help to state and local governments and provide them toolkits on getting deployment of broadband and digital inclusion. They have numerous grants that we can learn from. We actually are having a presentation from someone from a former NTIA grantee, which I'm very excited about. So I would urge that as a working group, we continue to collaborate with NTIA and benefit from the work that they've already done.
If I could add something too, thank you, Anna, for that. We fully intend to engage with the Broadband Interagency Working Group through NTIA.
Thank you.
Particularly since there are at least 25 federal agencies that are involved with that working group, because we'd like for our principles to be spread across the federal government as well as filter down to the states and municipalities. But they've already done some great work, so there's no reason to reinvent the wheel, but we would like to very much work closely with them in developing these principles.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
This is Hareen Contractor. One thing I would like to add in terms of overbuild, I know there's some efforts going on around this currently, but in terms of the broadband working group, the main issue that I saw personally is the address issues. Not one agency collects addresses the same way, so it's difficult to actually pinpoint where overlap is occurring, because it's difficult to actually put data set in a way where you can actually track these things. It gets a little technical, but if we could start standardizing address collection, that would go a long way to recognize overbuild.
Okay, thank you.
I have one more question.
Yes, Marita.
Well, not question, I just wanted to commend you all for addressing the overbuilding issue. As a legal practitioner, I represented a small rural telephone company that was very frustrated about the way that the BTOP funds were used to finance an overbuild, when had they been able to take advantage of the BTOP funds themselves, they could have built out. These are communities that aren't even that far from DC, so sometimes we get, we're in this urban area and we don't recognize that some of these issues are legitimate issues. So I commend you for putting that on the table.
So,
Yes, Henry.
I just had a question about these principles. Once you develop them,
that's right.
where do they go to the commission? Or I assume they go to the commission, since we're an advisory body of the commission. But the commission is not, as Anna just pointed out, not the only one involved in this broadband deployment.
Well, the commission
effort.
also serves, thank you, Henry. We certainly want to submit this to the commission, because that's the sequence that we'd have to do as you have to do as the full advisory committee.
Right.
However, the commission is a member of the NTIA's broadband working group and also the rural broadband working group through Department of Agriculture. So through the commission, given their interagency involvement with other agencies, we hope that the commission can facilitate disbursement to other organizations as well.
But that's the plan,
Yes.
essentially, that you're embracing. Okay.
Yes.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Upon ratification by the full committee.
Right.
Yes.
I commend the question, Heidi. I think that's very important. We can develop all the beautiful principles, but it's not get down to the trenches and be implemented. It's just a lot of hot air and talk and recommendations on the shelf. So I love to see our recommendation submitted to the commission and something action be taken and the work get down to the trenches so that our intention will be fully implemented and the people who are supposed to be beneficiary of this will actually get the benefits.
Well, and I think that's helpful, Heather, for your subgroup to consider as they move forward. And all of you were working on that with the idea of not only developing the principles, but then what do we recommend to be done with them afterwards? Thank you. That's good input. Thank you, everyone. Yes. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Access Subgroup, for a great presentation and recommendations and the hard work and commitment that you're putting into getting our work done. Next, I would like to introduce the adoption subgroup, and presenting on behalf of the adoption subgroup is Chris Wood. And thereafter, we have an important guest with us who will follow that. Will be introduced by Chris. Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Vice Chair, FCC staff, fellow committee members, and my subgroup head, Heather. On behalf of the entire group, we have been working very hard to meet with digital inclusion scholars, working not only to better understand the issues around the digital divide, but possible and active solutions working to close the digital divide. As Heather outlined in her opening statements, we wanted them to focus on answering 3 questions for us. Share what they know and don't know about the digital divide, what barriers are present for those impacted by the digital divide, and what is working and not working, and ask them to share research and scholarly papers that can help advise us best. Today, I'd like to share 5 initial observations we've gleaned for our discussion thus far. One of the major barriers that continues to come up is access to sufficient broadband. Our scholars have shared specific research and program implementation that works directly within the community to identify unique barriers to adoption and programs that communities can take to help reduce barriers of adoption. 2, research and scholars have also been able to highlight and remind us that the digital divide continues to be amplified in certain minority communities. Whether those communities are impacted by the digital divide within a specific minority or geographic barrier, or a combination of the 2, place-based strategies to support these communities is key. Smartphones have also continued to change the landscape of the digital adoption, especially home broadband adoption. We're continuing to meet with scholars and experts to better understand the adoption so we can provide recommendations to the full committee. We've really been on an information-seeking hunt. We've also, deployment continues to be a local issue, which we must acknowledge the importance of, thinking about the programmatic work on the ground, and then providing recommendations at the federal level to be able to implement these. It continues to go back to the fact that these programs and closing the digital divide and adoption continues to go back to a local initiative, especially in our rural and hard-to-reach communities. And finally, but most certainly not least, digital literacy training and digital readiness, especially with community-based initiatives, are important to building capacity and long-term solutions for access. And this has been consistent across a lot of the information that we've gathered thus far. Those are the recommendations, those are the areas that we've really been looking at, where we've really been seeking information. And over the next couple months, we're going to continue to meet with scholars and continue to meet with experts in the field to better understand what are these adoption barriers, to make sure we have a full picture before putting recommendations to the full committee. I know that many of my colleagues have eagerly been seeking across the country to make sure that we are gathering the best possible information from the best possible experts in the field. And so I thank them for their hard work, and I look forward to continuing this exploration over the next couple months and providing recommendations. With that, I will turn it over to Elizabeth Lindsay, the Executive Director of Bite Back.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am so thrilled to be here, and as Anna mentioned, we, Bite Back, received a BTOP grant a few years ago, before I was at Bite Back, but that really completely transformed the trajectory of the organization. That investment enabled us to teach hundreds and hundreds more people to this day in the Washington, D.C. area. So it's a wonderful program, and we're very appreciative of it. There is a PowerPoint slide, like a printout of a PowerPoint slide in your folder. So that's kind of what I'm following, if you want to pull that out. And now it's projected, so thank you very much. I would like to start by introducing you all to Patron. Patron is a Bite Back student. She, a few years ago, was working in a job that was tech-based, and her skills became obsolete. And like many people, Patron really struggled to find work. She didn't have the skill set that she needed to find a job that enabled her to support herself and her son. And then Patron came to Bite Back. She received training that started at a digital literacy level and moved up into more advanced training. She received an industry-recognized certification, and now she's working as an IT help desk technician. She's moved into the middle class, and her future is completely different than what it was before. There are millions of Americans like Patron, people who have been left behind by the age of digital transformation and left behind in the digital economy. There are 28 million adult Americans who are living in poverty, and at the same time, according to the Brookings Institution, since 2002, the U.S. economy has lost 28 million low-tech jobs. These are jobs that at one time required no or low-tech skills, and now these jobs don't exist anymore, or they require medium and high-tech skills. And the people who have been left behind, the people who have lost these jobs, are the same people who have typically been left behind in our economy. And can you go to the next slide, please? They're older working Americans, they're people without college degrees, they're women, they're people of color, they're single parents. And while this is evidence of a continued disparity in our economy, it also provides an incredible opportunity. There are 30 million high-paying jobs in the United States that don't require a college degree. And with tech skills, we can move many of these individuals into these careers. At Bite Back, we train adults starting at the very beginner level, and there are very few organizations in the country where an adult learner can go, learn basic skills. We have hundreds of people who come to us every year who've never turned on a computer before, and they live here in Washington, D.C., which is one of the most educated cities in the country. And so we're one of the only places where they can come, start at that beginner level of training, and then move up into getting those skills that enable them to move into the workforce. We provide training in Microsoft Excel and Outlook to prepare people to move into general administrative computer-based careers, as well as we provide training in the A+ certification, which is preparation for an IT help desk technician role. And so we really know and see every day the impact of digital literacy training on people like Patron and hundreds of people every year in this region. Next slide, please. Thank you. We would not be able to do this work without partnerships with key anchor institutions. DC government, the state of Maryland, our library system, these are some of our key funders and also key partners. We teach hundreds of people every year, for example, in DC public libraries, and these are individuals for whom the library system often provides their only access to the internet. We have a really unique partnership with the DC Office of the Chief Technology Officer, where they have built out a mobile lab, a mobile tech lab, that we literally park in front of public housing units in communities where they don't have computer labs, they don't have access to tech, and we teach our classes on that bus. We also are building more and more relationships with schools. We really see that technology is so required for school children now. I know that we talk a lot about this in our group, the homework gap. And I'm a parent. I have a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old, and the way we communicate with my daughter's teachers are through email. And without that it would be very difficult to be able to know what they were learning. And so we really believe that without providing these types of skills to the parents of children, it's going to increasingly be difficult to bring whole families onto the other side of the digital divide. As part of my work, I have learned so much from the adoption subgroup, and I also am on the board of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. And over the past few years, I've had the pleasure of speaking with other digital literacy providers across the country. And there are some challenges that many of us face across the board. It's really hard to find funding for digital literacy. Bite Back is unique in that we provide digital literacy training as well as workforce development, and so a lot of our funding comes to us because of the workforce development work we do. But many organizations that focus solely on digital literacy really struggle to find sources of funding, and that's another reason why those partnerships with anchor institutions are so key. Across the nonprofit sector, we all struggle with finding resources to effectively use data. We're increasingly asked by our funders to provide reports and outcomes on what we do, and we need to be able to use data in real time to understand the impact of our work. But it's, again, another area where we don't have a lot of capacity and where there's very little funding. This subgroup, as Chris shared, has done an incredible job in looking at best practices around these issues and meeting with experts. And I think that's another area that a lot of digital literacy providers that we could really benefit from, really understanding what the best practices are. And I think Dr. Turner-Lee's work and the work of think tanks has been really incredible, kind of bridging the gap between academia and the sector. Access to the corporate sector is another area that is so key. Many of the adults who are going into digital literacy programs don't fit the mold of what corporate employers are necessarily looking for. They might not have a college degree. They have experiences that don't align with a typical career path. And so we really need the support and partnership of companies that are interested and willing to give internships and give employment to these individuals. It's without those jobs, we're not going to be able to address these issues of inequality. And then again, I'll come back to funding. A lot of funding in the nonprofit sectors, especially funding that comes from government agencies, is highly restricted. We'll get just enough money to train one individual, but that funding does not give us the resources we need to invest in research, to invest in our operations and administrative services that we need to run our organizations. And so here, these are some of the areas that I think I'm excited to work with the members of this committee around how do we bring these tools and resources to the digital literacy providers across the country. I love this work I do because I see every day that we really change people's lives. And I'm so thrilled to be here and excited to continue to work with all of you to come up with solutions to really bridge the digital divide. I think our country can look completely different through this work. We can really make a dent in these issues of inequality that we've talked about and thought about for years. And this moment of the digital economy really gives us an opportunity to make a change. And thank you so much for having me.
Elizabeth, can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
I think this mobile tech lab is a very interesting idea because it finds people in need where they are.
Exactly.
So have you any information on the level of success, or how often does it go into communities? I think this is a really interesting way to go about it by actually going to the people where the need is.
Absolutely. So we've taught a number of classes on the Mobile Tech Lab. I don't know the number exactly, but it's been very successful. It was interesting when we first rolled it out in partnership with DC government. There were things we hadn't thought of, like some of the chairs had wheels, and if we were parked on an incline, they would roll. But it's been really great. Octo found a DC artist to paint the truck, just a beautiful picture of a young girl at a computer. And it's really exciting when we park it in communities, people come to it. And yeah, and I would be happy to connect you with Delano Squires, who runs Connect DC here in DC, and he was really the person who thought of this idea. And the other organizations also teach classes when there are community events. The tech lab is parked there, and it's great to see kids going onto it and using the computers and learning skills. And I think I think it's something that a lot of communities could adopt.
Mm-hmm. Interesting, thank you.
Thank you.
Elizabeth, do you have a budget for that? Elizabeth, do you have a budget? We can talk about that, because I like that idea too.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
yes,
we
I'd
can
be-
partner with you on that and
Yeah,
help
that would be
to-
great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to talk with you about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So as you've heard, with the Bite Back presentation, we have been engaging experts in the field that are working really hard in the adoption field and identifying areas where we can improve. And so we're going to continue engaging with representatives from communities, working on digital inclusion initiatives, and learn from their experiences in the field. We're going to review these current policies and make sure that we are looking at both underserved, unserved, and underserved communities and how we can go ahead, like the bus idea. Develop a report and highlighting success stories, like some of those outlined in the Bite Back, but as well as other experts around the country. And those will include community anchor institutions, corporate affordable broadband initiatives, public-private initiatives, and interagency programs. And we will make, as I stated before the presentation, we'll make policy and/or FCC bully pit recommendations to advance broadband adoption within the context of more disruptive online ecosystems. Thank you very much. I'll turn it back over to Heather.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris and Elizabeth. I just wanted to open up and see if there are any questions or comments, additional comments for the adoption subgroup.
I have one. Marita Coley from MMTC. I would like to acknowledge Elizabeth and Bite Back as our 2017 Champion of Digital Equality honorees, and also just put on the record, but we can obviously talk about off the record, but getting Bite Back involved in the apprenticeship program that MMTC and National Urban League is leading, and has so far enrolled over 600 new apprenticeships in telecommunications through their affiliates, and would just like to put that on the record that we could talk and maybe make some connections, partnerships here in DC.
Thank you, that would be amazing.
Did you
Thank
want to say anything?
Okay. And I think it's also important to remember, I think it was S. Janelle who talked about how encouraging it is to see the amount of investment and incentives that are going towards broadband deployment in unserved and underserved communities. The scholars that we've been talking to also really emphasize the importance of the adoption side of things, and that is making sure that there are resources available for training in these communities. And so it was a perfect fit to have Bite Back serve as a witness for the adoption group in not only representing the subgroup, but representing that community that are out there working hard to make sure that once people have access to these networks, they can actually jump on them and use them and change their lives. And so that's the main reason why we have our our groups divided in those subgroups is specifically because we want to be able to focus on those access as a critical area, adoption as a critical area as well, and use. And this will lead me to my introduction of the youth subgroup. The youth subgroup really speaks to the socioeconomic implications of having access to next-gen networks. And when you have those discussions, it may not necessarily seem like a lot of work that is under FCC, But however, that's the reason why we do this. We have these networks and we advocate for them so that we can have an impact on the quality of life for people across the country. We do it because people can have jobs and find economic opportunity. And we do it so children can have the opportunity to just succeed. And so the youth subgroup serves to study those education and education and workforce development, which as time is going on is becoming closer and closer to the adoption discussion because we're starting to see that those two work closely together. It's no longer about just teaching people to get on the internet. It's teaching them the skills that they can take with them and use for the future. So with our youth subgroup are actually looking at education and workforce and the relationship between those two in advancing opportunities in underserved communities or minority communities. So that's what they've been studying. Harin Contractor is our next presenter, and he's a member of a subgroup that has been studying those related issues and is set to present to us a white paper for us to study and find some actions that we can present before the working group and the committee related to those issues. And for the most part, I see those as commission bully pulpit issues, and there may be some policy and interagency type opportunities there. So I wanted to go ahead and introduce Harin Contractors on the phone to talk to us a little bit about what he's working on, which is very related to the activities that the youth subgroup has been discussing. So Harin.
Thank you, Heather. I really appreciate that. Hi, everyone. Harin Contractor here, dialing in from sunny, beautiful Atlanta, Georgia. My apologies for not being there in person. My apologies for dialing in late. It's hard to keep children under the age of 4 healthy when you're traveling. So thanks for your flexibility. So this is an issue that's near and dear to my heart. From my perch at the Joint Center, working a lot on the future workforce development, in particular, underserved communities. And as Heather mentioned, there is a strong overlap, for youth adoption, digital readiness, as well as workforce development, and moving into the future in terms of the changing economy. And so I'm happy to talk about some of the, let me preface, this is my research that I've done, and our subgroup will look over some of the recommendations and policy discussions are diving in here and provide further actions, whether it's a white paper or a PowerPoint or what have you. I think that will still be determined, but we're trying to discuss some of these issues now. I want to present to you all, and our committee will come back with additional recommendations from here. So looking at this slide, I think everyone probably understands already there's significant issues that face underserved communities, persistent poverty, population declination, educational disparities, poor health outcomes that ties into closing of rural hospitals, major infrastructure issues, the lack of last mile transportation, we're here to talk about the lack of broadband access and take-up, lack of financial inclusion, and something that gets overlooked, not only just in Flint, but all over the Deep South actually is crumbling wastewater infrastructure. And I point out all these things because these are not just related to digital issues. These are issues that face the entire community. And I think aligning resources and allowing the community to harvest innovation can generate mobility. So we're not just talking about equity here. We're talking about leapfrogging the current situations and using technology as a way to break through some of the persistent issues and structural issues that have been facing the community. And that's what we're talking about. We need new solutions. We need creative thinking and coordination for amplification. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit here, and then we'll dive in it again after this presentation over the coming weeks and months further on these issues. So going to the next slide. Here are some ideas that we at the Joint Center thought that might be useful. And again, we're going to dive into this more from the perch of our think tank, but a lot of these ideas need that basic infrastructure. We need that broadband build-out, the fiber build-out, 5G build-out to enable some of these activities. But there are options here that show promise. So one way is blended learning. If you don't understand that term, it's the use of distance learning to complement in-person learning. Because right now what we found is online learning as itself is not a substitute for education. The outcomes so far for online only are actually very poor compared to in-person outcomes. What actually is working is a blend of that online learning with in-person facilitators and instructors. We need to increase the quality of education that folks get. A lot of these communities, you know, we've heard this time and time again, there's people in those communities who are not math majors that are teaching math, and it's really difficult. The quality of education is not there that these children need, and some of the opportunities are not there. So enable blended learning can help with that. Partnerships with community colleges, HBCUs, Teacher America, other key allies can enable some of these blended learning to actually help take off. And we've seen some of these pilots in pockets, especially in the deep rural South, but they need some of that basic infrastructure. And it's not only applicable to K through 12. It can help community colleges. It can help vocational training, and in particular credential courses for folks to be able to get some of these like good jobs that are currently available that they're not able to get into. Blockchain, I think a lot of this is still kind of amorphous. A lot of people are still trying to figure this out, but it does hold some promise, particularly for underserved communities. You know, entrepreneurs are actually testing features to address food deserts in communities, greater financial inclusion, and in particular health monitoring, because we know health and education are so strongly correlated that we need to address this issue if we're actually going to help develop these community skills and long-term, lifelong learning opportunities. And so blockchain might be an opportunity to do this, but again, needs that basic infrastructure. Telemedicine is the same way. While hospitals close, there's greater opportunities for telemedicine and connected health centers. So creating a space for secure records so patients can access these no matter what facility they're in, no matter what doctor they see or where they happen to be ill, they can access those records from a secure location, a secure place. I think that's critical for these communities. Rideshare. Again, there is not a rideshare opportunity for communities in rural areas. You know, maybe the economics don't quite work yet, but this is a way to address these last mile transportation issues. People in these communities don't have access to, particularly African Americans have lower access to car ownership in rural communities than others. There's not robust infrastructure for buses, and they're expensive, and for other transportation options, and therefore some communities are actually moving to subsidized rideshare opportunities for their communities. But again, if you're not able to get on your phone to like hail an Uber or hail a Lyft, it's kind of difficult for you to get to education opportunities, health opportunities, to be able to get to where you need to go. So the last bit, I know this is a bit controversial, white space, but at least it's new thinking that's going on to help address folks to get into broadband, to get digital included. And so we need additional experimentations, innovations, and we need to evaluate this to see how effective these are. I bring all this up to go to the next slide here, is that the United States, in terms of all its OECD member nations, is amongst the lowest in terms of what they spend on active labor market policy. So that's what we spend to get folks trained up for jobs that are currently available or might be available in the future. And I want to talk about this for a minute because it's important. In the 1990s, the United States was not ready for the trade tsunami that occurred. You know, and it wasn't just NAFTA, it was just globalization in general. We were not ready, and trade adjustment assistance and other government programs were not adequately funded or supported enough to help folks get through this globalization change, and folks and communities got left behind. Things are changing right now at a rapid pace, whether it's automation, whether it's artificial intelligence. We know it's coming. So for the United States to be able to address this, because we learned our lessons from the 90s, so the country should do that now to be able to start addressing some of these active labor market policies. However, no one's going to start passing $1 trillion package to do training tomorrow. So going to the next slide, what we probably need to do is start better aligning resources to get into places that make it more effective for folks to get workforce development and lifelong learning. You know, the nature of work is changing. We need to be able to leverage these changes to enable mobility. And so one thing I wanted to mention is, so we're going to come out with a report here very soon along with Georgetown, talking about good jobs that are actually in a lot of these communities that don't require a college degree, but a lot of underserved communities, particularly African Americans, are underrepresented in these good jobs. You know, these are a lot of your typical trade skill jobs. These are your your education jobs or management jobs, or advanced manufacturing jobs, but there needs to be some credentialing and there's some signaling that goes to this. While they don't require the heavy investment of a 4-year degree, there's still some signaling and credentialing that are needed, and we need to reduce these barriers for folks to get into it. And right now, the workforce and education systems are antiquated and underfunded. And so we need to reduce some of these barriers. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this in the coming weeks and months about how to reduce some of these barriers. But I know the FCC has done some of this in terms of excessive occupational licensing. It particularly harms folks who are formerly incarcerated and folks who are trying to get distance credentials. And so a public-private partnership, there are private individuals in this room who represent corporations who have folks that need to be licensed to do some of these work. They can work with local and federal governments to try to reduce some of these barriers. That would be a huge advantage, particularly for underserved communities in underserved areas. One thing that we worked on when I was at the Department of Labor was with the WIOA initiative. We call for leveraging libraries as workforce and career development centers. I personally have not seen as much of that. I think this is an area that's ripe for additional alignment to get more bang for the buck. From my perch when I was at USAC, there was very low eat rate take up for libraries. And this is one way that the FCC, USAC, Department of Labor, IMLS, the Institute of Management Libraries Services work together to make libraries to be one of the forefront institutions to help underserved communities, because there are libraries in underserved communities. It is one of the backbone of these communities. However, it's being underutilized as centers for resume buildup, for career workshops, for training, and I believe that's one way we can help align resources and get more bang for the buck. Going to the next slide, I wanted to show you all visually some of these underserved communities. So the map you're looking at right here are persistent poverty communities, communities who have been, their population, for over 20% of the population has been persistent poverty for over 30 years. That is unacceptable. And you can easily tell these are underserved communities in the deep rural South. These are Native American communities. These are rural Appalachia. These are communities that don't fit one particular demographic, but they span the whole gambit. And I think we need to do a better job of trying to address these communities and aligning some of the resources better to do that. And so to the next slide, there's an initiative currently called 10-20-30, which is providing 10% of federal funding from currently four government agencies where at least 20% of the population has lived at or under the poverty line for 30 years. So since 2009, it's funded 4,000 projects that include wastewater infrastructure, expanding health centers, and building on broadband. There is probably a need right now for Congress to boost this, not only to boost the funding, but go beyond the current 4 federal agencies that are mandated to do this. There should be a public-private push potentially to do that. Again, this is one of a bully pulpit initiative. The final bit here I would like to say is talk about the public-private push to push for more 12+2 efforts. So right now, the U.S. education system is not adequately addressed to do more of this German or European-style workforce development, vocational training, where we start pushing that earlier to middle school and high school years. One of the easiest and first steps to do this is try actually moving toward free or low-cost community colleges. Tennessee Promise and Tennessee Reconnect provides interesting models for folks to do upskilling for students and adult learners. And they do a really good job of working with private sector and public sector folks to align their workforce development system into the education model. Again, this is a nonpartisan, a bipartisan solution that seems to be picking up steam. I know a lot of people heard that, this narrative of free community college in 2016, but again, Tennessee provides some of the models to help do this. And so in the final slide here, again, these are maybe recommendations are strong words, but considerations we should talk about moving the needle. We should leverage the coming technology to help folks leapfrog their current situation. And so we will work on whether it's a white paper or a slide deck or something for the FCC to act as a bully pulpit to recommend some of these, considerations, or as the working group to bring folks from the public-private education community sectors to come together. One thing I failed to mention before I end is that in any of these activities that we talk about, the community needs to be first. One thing I saw at the Department of Labor right now, and when we're working with folks on the ground, is that training too many times are one size fits all. and it does not work for the community that you're actually trying to affect when you're trying to build technology or training in a bubble, whether it's out in Silicon Valley or whether it's in the Beltway. These things need to be built with the community, hand in hand, together. And so I appreciate you all listening to some of these findings and some of this research, and be looking forward to talking to you more about this. Thank you.
Thank you. This is Diane. I have a question, and then we may have others also. I was struck by the fact that the libraries don't seem to be being used effectively, and I wondered if you knew why that is, especially with your last comment that it needs to be something that's done in a community. It would seem that a library would be a natural place in a community to make that happen. Was there some reason that's preventing that from happening?
Can you mute? Sorry. Yes, that's an interesting point. We tried to dive into that at USEC. So sometimes individual libraries can apply for some of these grants. Other times they're done as a consortia for all the states together to apply, and then they divide it out. I think, one, it's a lack of awareness. Two, it's a lack of coordination, because there's American Job Centers where folks can actually go get retrained. But some of those, depending on where you are, have some skilled workers and others don't. There's been some efforts. Kentucky actually did a pretty good job early on where they started training their librarians and using some of the funds available in WIOA to start using those as workforce centers. But again, it's not taken up. I'm not sure particularly why. I think people, particularly local and state governments, may look at libraries as one particular institution, put that in the bucket, rather than looking as a center for the community. Maybe it's territorial. Maybe they feel their resources might be taken away from one bucket to put there. I'm talking about aligning resources that people can start working together on this. I talked to the Chief Technology Officer and the Executive Director, IMLS. They rarely, if ever, talk to USAC or Department of Labor in terms of coordinating their grant funds. And so when we're talking about, the previous presentation, talking about coordinating resources, this is one area that's ripe for coordinating resources. We could look at the map. It's pretty easy to say, hey, these are persistent poverty, underserved communities. Where are the number of libraries that are in these facilities? Can we coordinate the grants that go to these places and do it more effectively? I think that basic data can help make a huge impact with these communities.
Okay, Nicole, you wanted to respond, and then Sherman, you have a comment.
I want to actually just make sure that the committee also speaks clearly, more accurate about libraries. Libraries are doing work. And I think it's not a fair assessment for us to say that the libraries are not doing their part. Libraries around the country still remain to be the primary location for people to access broadband. And libraries have been much more adaptable to ensuring that people can actually transfer the access home. In New York City, the partnership that they have to give Wi-Fi hotspots out have been extensively studied in terms of building capacity within the household. Texas also has several models. So I think we need to just, given the absence of actually going deep on that particular aspect, we have to kind of pull back a little bit. Libraries also they have particular funding models that they benefit from. Again, I would just caution the committee to throw the baby out with the bathwater without representation from IMLS, as well as other libraries have been very proactive. In fact, I was just at a conference where libraries are talking about, Diane, the things that they're doing. And I think it would be an understatement for us to actually say that they are not playing a huge role. Historically, they have been a convening place. They will continue to be a convening place. In terms of coordination resources, they obviously have a different bucket when it comes to individual access. And so the question becomes, how are they using their resources? If you go to every city or state around this country, librarians as well as library institutions are trying to figure out how to tap into city, state, federal resources to make sure they have it. The larger question is, do we have enough libraries in communities of color? That's the question, not necessarily the question of whether or not libraries are actually doing their part.
Okay. Elizabeth, let me, if I can, we'll come back to you. Sherman?
My question to you is that you mentioned that there were 4 government agencies that support 10, 20, 30. You didn't actually name those agencies. What are those 4 government agencies?
Yeah, so I need to look back. So off the top of my head, it was USDA. There was a particular. It divides. It's some efforts from Department of Commerce. I believe it was Department of Justice, and then there's one other. I apologize, not off the top of my head, but there's only 4 agencies. And within the agencies, there's only a couple of sub-agencies that provide funding to this.
Well, if you could, sounds like you're not so sure about it, and that's only 3. But if you could provide that information, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I can actually, I'll try to pull that up here while we're talking.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
I just wanted to add on to Nicole's comments. As a practitioner here in Washington, D.C., we have an extremely strong partnership with the D.C. Public Libraries. We actually receive more funding and support from the libraries than we do from the local workforce development system. And many of our participants, that is their often, in addition to Bite Back, that's their sole source of access to broadband, and that is where they go to apply for jobs and to get training, and that's been a really strong partnership. And I do think a huge part of the issue is a lack of coordination. I don't think that libraries and workforce development systems in general, I'm sure it happens in some places, but in general, they're not working together.
I agree. I don't mean to mischaracterize that they're not doing anything. I apologize. I love libraries. I love the work they do. I was working with them, the folks at IMLS and at USAC. But again, I make the point, it's the lack of coordination. And therefore, if we're talking about using the best resources together, I think it behooves folks to have better coordination in terms of this, particularly with libraries.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for your comments, and thank you, Erin, for all the work that you're doing and contributing to the youth subgroup.
Yep. So, so for the 10-20-30, it is Department of Agricultural Rural Housing Service. It is the Department of Commerce Economic Development Initiative. It is the Environmental Protection Agency, and is the Department of Treasury Community Development Financial Institutions Fund. So those are the 4 particular agencies, sub-agencies that provide support for 10-20-30.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, before I move on, one more comment to make on the libraries. I think one of the issues that libraries encounter is that for a long time, people in leadership didn't understand their role when it came to digital inclusion. The librarian basically today is expected to act as a counselor, teacher, tax attorney, because everybody goes to the library in order to use their computers, and by default, it means the librarian is the one that's training them to do whatever it is they need to do. And I think particularly with the more rural libraries that are aching to do more, one of the biggest challenges when budgets get cut, the libraries are the top of that block. And so you have a lot of libraries in communities where they can't even open every single day to provide service. And that's a disservice not only to students that don't have a place to go to do homework, or people that are looking for jobs and sort of, so for a long time we've been fighting for that, for the library to be looked at for what it represents in the community.
You know, that seems like such a huge opportunity for an organization like SCORE and places like that to be able to help with those libraries. I mean, there are so many very well-educated people that might be open to doing that through something like SCORE. I don't know if they've connected there, but boy, that makes a lot of sense to see if there aren't people out there that would be willing to be part of that.
Yep. I drive past my public library on a regular basis, and there are kids in the parking lot using the Wi-Fi for homework after hours. And this is on the phone. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you again, Harin. Look forward to more of your work and the outputs that are going to come out of the youth group. So in closing, I would like to hand the mic over to Dr. Nicole. Nicole will help to close, and she will share with us some endeavors that she's been on that will help to summarize what we've talked about today and close on behalf of our subgroup.
Madam Chair, I have one question
Oh,
for
sorry.
you all before you went on. And it goes back to your I think some of your representatives from the larger cable companies, I think it was Charter, Verizon, even Comcast, and this goes back to the supplier diversity initiative. And I thought what I heard in the report was that there was you were talking about the difficulty of smaller businesses doing business with some of the larger corporations, including possibly some of the cable operators. So were those? So my question were those companies represented at the supplier diversity initiative, that like the Charters, the Comcast, the Verizons, were they there?
Yes, they were. Off the top of my head, I think it was AT&T, Verizon, Charter, Comcast, T-Mobile. So the large, really mobile and cable provider ISPs.
Because
were
when part of the recommendation was that that there would be that on the FCC's website that the supplier diversity that supply diversity contacts for those companies you could get contacts for the supply diversity leaders of those companies on was that kind of part of the recommendation? Maybe I don't want to mischaracterize, but that's kind of how I understood it.
Yes, that's correct. In fact, the representatives on the panels were Charter Communications, T-Mobile, Verizon, AT&T, as well as Act One Group, Comdex.
Would you repeat those?
This is available on the FCC's website.
I was just asking if you could.
Certainly. Charter Communications, T-Mobile, Verizon, AT&T, as well as the Act One Group, Comdex, Pinnacle Group, the IT Architect Corporation, excuse me. These were representatives of the private sector, and many of them also sat in on the last session, which is the one-on-one networking opportunities for Business Consultation 101. So the 40 small businesses that participated in that particular consultation stage, representatives from these larger companies sat with them to walk them through and to educate them about their own supplier diversity plans. That was on the June 4th conference. Moving forward, we propose to do the same, as well as keep that portal and keep that database available as well. So that those type of communications can continue throughout the year.
Very good. Thank you.
Certainly.
Okay, well, Nicole, if you can help us close this discussion.
So I think a lot has already been said. So at the risk of being redundant, I'll just leave. Heather asked me to sort of tie up all of the loose ends of all of the various working groups that were part of our subgroup. And to those of you that have only one presenter, we've upped our game on this side. Just so you know.
The gauntlet has been put down.
Okay, exactly. So just be ready after the break. And at the risk of standing between lunch and a break, I'll keep it very concise. So Heather asked me to actually say something for a couple of reasons. As you all know, looking at digital divide issues has been something that I've done for almost 20 years, worked in communities on that, as well as currently working on a book that will come out next year on digital invisibility among groups that the internet is slowly and surely creating a new underclass. And so what I wanted to do was to share, and as in this wrap up, in just a moment, some photos of a 10-city tour that I've taken to just sort of exemplify and amplify why we took the time that we did today to go through all of those specific segments. When Larry Irvin conceived of the concept of the digital divide when he was at NTIA, a lot of that had to do with the beginning shift of the use of technology and how it was impacting society. At that time, and Elizabeth can attest to this based on her work as a practitioner, we were dealing with the haves and the have-nots, people who either had access or they did not have access. As you can see from Haren's slides, that when we look at issues related to blockchain, the digital sharing economy, and others, the digital divide has become much more sophisticated and much more complicated. It's not only whether or not you have access to a device like a PC, a laptop, or a smartphone. It also matters if you have access to connectivity, whether it's fiber or wireline, wireless, or emerging technologies like 5G. It's also dependent upon whether or not you have access to financial collateral. You cannot get an Uber in this country without a bank account. You cannot be engaged in fintech without access to the combination of technology, financial collateral, and the ability to understand what is actually happening to your data at that time. And so part of what we wanted to stress in our working group, as we go down this pathway, which is one of the reasons that we've engaged experts, and we've taken a combined approach of looking at deployment, looking at use in terms of how it relates to people, and looking at adoption cases, which is this last subgroup, on how people are actually going to take this technology and improve the quality of their lives. That's been most important to us. So I'm going to just share, at the end of the day, as we sit in Washington, D.C., stories of people that I happened to meet on a visit to Stanton, Virginia, which is less than 2.5 hours away from Washington, to just show how significant and critical the work of this subcommittee is to the FCC and other agencies that are paying attention. And I want to also just caveat, as I sit next to my friend Susan, as we talk about these issues as it relates to diverse communities, we have to do a better job when it comes to adoption and use for Asian Americans.
Thank you.
I want to say that. Thank you. You're welcome. Just wanted to say that. All right. So in Stanton, Virginia, 2.5 hours outside of Washington, D.C., by all intents and purposes, it is a Main Street America community. It is rural America, because as you go further, your signals weaken, and you're lucky if you can actually stay online. We meet two people. Next slide. One of them that is sitting right here, Chris Wood, who is the co-founder of LGBT Tech Partnership, who's headquartered in Stanton, Virginia. Chris's organization works with homeless LGBTQ youth to ensure that they have access to technology. They have just recently been part of the opening of a new incubator in this small town of Stanton, Virginia, who every day wishes that they had sustainable access to help these rural individuals who have the burden of coming out, the possibility of being evicted, who face this opportunity of having to find resources to stay afloat, and in comes LGBT Tech to leverage the Lifeline program to provide them with mobile technology that they can stay connected to this world. He plays a part in closing the digital divide as an organization. Next to him is Tarod Robinson. He's a formerly homeless African-American father who moved to Stanton from Richmond and Charlottesville, who opened a barbershop in the middle of this small community and has a Wi-Fi hotspot because he doesn't realize he needs to close the homework gap. In Stanton, Virginia, just like in rural America, there are over 50 million people across the country who do not have access to broadband. Stanton is no exception, particularly since many of the African Americans came there post-Reconstruction, who thought they were coming for great livable wage jobs, became domestics. They face the inequalities of being on the other side of the digital divide, both socially and economically and politically. They are disenfranchised. So Tarod Robinson decided with his one share barbershop to solve that problem by allowing kids to get a haircut and do their homework at the same time. Next slide. Those two that I previously spoke about are trying to close the digital divide. And this young family that I happened to meet in this particular visit, that's Joseph Mulgrave, his fiancee Kizzy, and their 2 children. Joseph is a 4th-generation Stanton resident. He grew up in that community. He literally lives on the other side of the railroad tracks. He's underemployed, but yet he has the burden of now having a family. His fiancée, Kizzy, lives with her mother. I asked them, how do you survive having or not having internet access in America? They all have phones. That's a good thing. In fact, they have phones to the point that that is their only gateway to internet access. They do not have other hardware. In the case of Kizzy, because she's income constrained, she literally turns off her cellular data and gets on her mother's prepaid cable option to be able to provide access for her kids. They have one tablet within her mother's house that the kids share. And in my interview with her, she says that's the only way that we can have the kids see beyond, where we're living right now. In Joseph's case, he acknowledges, and again, this is to bring context and color to these stories that we talk about in this subcommittee, that he needs his phone to get a job, because that's the only way he's going to be able to find out how he can work. But the unfortunate thing is halfway through the month, his minutes run out, his data plan is expended, and as he told me, his phone becomes a box. Does Joseph know about Lifeline? Not at all. So I share his story, and it was actually profound to the point that it brought me to tears to have, at this stage in my life, do a tour and find out that there are people in America that do not have internet access, much like we all take for granted. As someone said earlier, in a visit to Hartford, Connecticut next, which was another part of my visits, I met the young girls that go to McDonald's and do their homework because they cannot get access in their home because of the price, and they honestly can't get it in their school because these are old buildings that cannot hold a Wi-Fi signal. So they can't benefit from the ubiquitous Wi-Fi that's being offered right now through the FCC. So without going further, because obviously many of you know me, know I could talk, I'm going to actually just bring us back to Elizabeth's story as we wrap up the work of this committee. Each and every day there's work being done to close the digital divide, and what our committee is really trying to do is to figure out how we balance the equation. Deployment is obviously an issue, which is why the committee has put out the recommendations regarding redlining, overbuilding, paying close attention to the incentives that are driving broadband deployment adoption universally and ubiquitously. The reason that we pay attention to supply diversity, because the goal is, Sherman, I think you pointed this out in your comments, not directly. The more that we push deployment, the more opportunities should exist for diverse suppliers to actually be part of the building of that ecology. In terms of the work that we're trying to do to align the workforce goals with what digital access looks like, to ensure that the focus of closing the digital divide is just not on deployment of resources. You can build it, but it does not necessarily mean that they will come. Joseph Mulgrave has access because he's using a phone in some capacity. But whether or not he has the money to actually pay for it is a different story. And so our committee is very interested in balancing out what does digital adoption and use look like in this new economy. And we're fortunate to have a mix of corporate and civil society leaders and think tank leaders to talk through how do we balance the equation to pull in all parts. So I would just leave to say that the work that we're doing on our side, it applies to people. And that's why Heather asked me to show these photos. If you want more about the photo stories, available on the Brookings website on my expert page. But these are the people that we are talking about, and these are the people that this particular subsection of this full working group needs to stay focused on in this exploration and inquiry around how do we create a more diverse and equitable ecosystem that allows for everybody to benefit, not the haves and the have-nots anymore, but for everybody to benefit from what will be the forthcoming and emerging technology landscape that, I'm sorry, everybody, will include robots and automation that people on the wrong side of the digital divide will not be able to take advantage of. So I'll leave with that, Heather, and I want to, again, on behalf of the committee and our very long and thorough report. Thank our fearless and committed leader who, yes, kept us on many calls to come up with these product deliverables. Madam Chairwoman, our chairwoman, did her part to ensure that we actually met the requirements for today, as well as with the help of Ms. Jamila Best Johnson. Thank you.
Can I just say this? I so echo what you said about Dr. Nicole Lee. I so echo what you said about it's not about the haves and have-nots. That's why I remember in one conversation I asked you, where are you going to go? I want you to go to Ohio. In Ohio, Columbus, there are the haves. They have not. They don't have that. So let's marry the two, the haves and have-nots. The have-nots in Stanton, Virginia, the haves in Columbus. Let's work together and push that over the line.
Thank you very much.
Well, I found her in China and told her to come back for this.
That is one relentless chair.
Yeah, as you can see, I'm on all of the subcommittees, which is why I had to say something.
Well, thank you. I think we've gone over our time, and I just wanted to, again, express my appreciation for all the hard work that my working group is putting in to get this done. And we look forward to coming back in May with our recommendations and our best practices. And we're looking to move the needle with the work that we're doing. So again, thank you. And I
Well, on behalf of the rest of us, well done. Well done. Thank you. And now, the important part of the meeting, the one you've all been waiting for. Thank you to Wiley Ryan and Anna, because she fed us breakfast, and now she's going to feed us lunch. So we will be back here at 12:30. We will start up again at precisely 12:30. Thank you all for the morning, and let's have as productive an afternoon. Thank you.
And let us know if you want to huddle.
Where's my napkin?
Thanks again, Heather, for a great presentation this morning, and to the work of your entire group. It was so informational, useful, and helpful for all of us, so I thank you very much. Appreciate it. And Michael, would you please introduce yourself and welcome to our table?
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Michael Brown with Verizon. I'm standing in as the alternate for Donna Epps.
Welcome.
Thank
We're
you.
happy to have you. Thank you. All right, anyone else that I've missed that we haven't? Oh, yes, please.
Hi, my name is Shelley Blakeney, and I'm standing in for Marie Sella Dixon, T-Mobile.
Thank you very much. Thank you. All right. So we're going to continue on with our working group presentation, and we're going to move it over to Gavin, who is going to be doing the Diversity and Tech Working Group.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. So we are the Diversity and Tech Working Group. First, I'd like to say that Mr. Morial gives his regrets that he could not make it today, but with the pending holidays and scheduling, he wasn't on there. So first, I would, if I can start up the PowerPoint. First, I would like to remind the committee what the approved recommendation was for the March 27th, 2018 committee was, and that was that the Diversity and Tech Working Group, on behalf of the ACDDE, would organize roundtables with identified members of the tech community. The ideal representatives of that committee would have authority to implement diversity and inclusion initiatives, and the roundtables would be conducted on the West Coast and then the East Coast if needed. And the ultimate goal of the roundtables were to be develop best practices guides for tech diversity and inclusion. So the bulk of this presentation will be a report out to the committee on the results of that first roundtable, some initial takeaways that we have had since then, and next steps. So we will not be presenting any further recommendations at this time, as we're simply reporting out on where we are in our progress. First, with the roundtable format. We held the roundtable on July 30th at the World Institute for Disability in Berkeley, California. It was an all-day event. We had presentations with 5 companies that ran from 45 to 60 minutes. I should note that these presentations were very informal. It was much more conversational, so that we could dive quickly into the substance of the conversation in detail and talk about those things that were really pressing. Also, as we mentioned in the last meeting, the reason for this format we chose is because we wanted the companies that we met with to be able to speak freely and candidly. So by doing it in this manner, we were able to keep the conversations themselves confidential, so that no one company would be identified in any disparaging way. And it would also allow them to be candid about some of the challenges, the hopes that they had for this committee moving forward, and some of the good things that they were doing, particularly those things that may be unique to them, but nonetheless they wanted to share. The topics during those conversations were broad, but as expected, they included, what is the current diversity statistics amongst the company, how they came to those numbers, items of that detail, as well as initiatives that they are currently undergoing, how they view the results of those initiatives, and then finally, some of the challenges that they felt, maybe as a company or as an industry, they faced in improving diversity and inclusion results. I think we all found that the people that we met with were very eager and willing, and to let you know who those companies were, we met with 5: Apple, Google, Facebook, Twitter, and Uber. All of them, these companies, there were others who were very interested, but for scheduling conflict, could not participate. And to put it bluntly, this ended up being a perfect number because we did not realize how long a day meeting with 5 companies and having such robust conversation would make up. So one of the things we found out in passing was that this made for a solid day in which we were able to get in depth with conversation, a lot of follow-up questions, and so forth and so on. But each of them did send high-ranking officials and within the company, varied depending on the structure internally who it was, but all of them were in fact in a position to implement a lot of diversity inclusion strategies, whether it be directly with HR or as a function of HR. Some initial takeaways that we had. Now, I will also be coming back to this slide at the end of the presentation because I would like to give the other members of the working group an opportunity to expound upon this and give their takeaways, just for the simple fact that this was the bulk and this was the purpose of doing this, was to really understand. And while we can't get into takeaways specific to companies, I think that there were a lot of things that we found surprised even us. Sometimes, we all have been in some capacity in the D&I space, and as a result of that, in our existing experience, we come assuming that certain things will be as they were. And I think we found that that was not the case. So the first thing that I mentioned was that we spoke to folks with a lot of experience. And while the tech companies themselves are very young in history in the D&I space, the people that we've met with were coming from across industry experience, had been in some of them as late as the 80s, So that was a pleasant and a pleasant surprise there, that there were people who were very seasoned diversity inclusion officers, had a wide-ranging perspective, were able to bring a cross-industry perspective to the conversation, both as it relates to diversity and inclusion on a broad scale, but also specifically as how the issue is impacting and being lived out within the tech industry, which again, when we think about the broader scale of companies in America, is a very short history. Another initial takeaway, and that I'm sure we'll be talking about a little more, is culture is really important. Within the tech industry, the culture is still evolving in an industry where human capital facing mandates were not front and center. So while these companies frankly have grown quickly and grown large, they are still in a lot of ways in infancy as a company and still developing the culture. So that was a common theme that we came across. And then another theme that we wanted to point out was the geographical culture within that. In a lot of instances, the companies are better positioned in many ways to capture global diversity versus domestic diversity. But there was a strong appreciation for that the diversity in the United States can but should not get lost in the mix with all that is going on. And finally, and also encouragingly, the companies are taking various and often nuanced approaches to diversity. There is a sense that we got the sense that there is a growing refrain from simply treating it as a compliance issue, check the box, and understanding that if they really want to tackle it, they have to do what they do best, which is disrupt the way things are naturally done. So many of the companies have started to focus on what are their existing strengths and how can they leverage those to improve on diversity approaches as well as outcomes. So, and then before I open it up to the rest of the group, I did want to make sure that we point out that what the next steps. And the first one that we came to is hosting an additional roundtable. One of the reasons why we had a great first roundtable, we did try to host an additional roundtable before this session. We had hoped to, but frankly speaking, scheduling was an issue. Particularly around this time, there were a lot of other events and panels and conferences that we just tried to work around. Many of them were diversity conferences, in fact. For example, not too long ago this month was Afrotech, and which occurred during the same week as one of the weeks that we looked to target. So what we will be doing as a result of that, in addition to hoping to host another roundtable, is leveraging some of those contacts. So many of our own members were attending these conferences. So we'll be leveraging those experiences and contact to bring back information so as to maximize the reach and range of data that we can bring back to the table and ultimately implement into whatever recommendations and best practices we come to. And then finally, of course, is the next step was to complete the report and recommendations for the spring of 2019. We will intend to have that completed before the final full committee meeting. And so with that, I'm going to kind of take a step back and go back to the initial takeaways conversation, because I really do believe that that is where the bulk of the work is and what we're doing, and that is where a lot of the excitement was for the committee members or the working group members after having met with particularly some notable companies, what those takeaways were. And if I may first, I think one of our working group members is on the phone, Kathleen. Kathleen, are you still with us?
I am indeed.
Great, great. So Kathleen, if you wouldn't mind starting us off on this part of the discussion, and particularly speaking to not only your takeaway, but for just to make clear to the rest of the committee, a lot of this in many ways we owe to Kathleen. She was kind of the leader in this effort, and the idea of leaving Washington and meeting the companies where they are. So Kathleen, if you could share with the group some of your perspective on how you first envisioned what this might be and how it came, the first roundtable actually was in practice, in addition to some of your takeaways. We greatly appreciate your perspective there.
Sure. Thanks, Gavin. And I wish I could take full credit for this. I can't. It was really a group effort with a lot of input from various people. But the concept was that we needed to gather information about what works and what doesn't work, because the scope of the advisory committee, given what we couldn't really mandate anything. So how do we add value? How do we gather information that could be shared and could make a difference for companies that are dealing with diversity and inclusion issues? So the team got together, and I have to emphasize it was a team effort. Everyone contributed, but the support from Jamila and Brenda was critical to us being able to pull off a roundtable discussion in California. And then Brian contributed by helping us find a location and figuring out food. And then all of the companies who showed up. And I think every one of our members will chat a little, but I thought I'd share two takeaways that surprised me. Because you think you understand the challenges of a particular issue, but until you start talking with the people who deal with it every day, you really don't. The first was that the diversity and inclusion leaders that we met were unbelievably impressive executives who are dedicated to making a difference in their companies. That said a lot to me, and I think all of those who attended or listened in on the meetings were equally impressed with what these folks are trying to do with sometimes small teams, sometimes larger teams, but they really have dedicated their careers to diversity and inclusion, and they've built a level of knowledge and experiences that I think we need to share across a wider base of companies, because many companies that are newer to this arena are taking the first baby steps, so why not learn from those about what works and what doesn't? The second takeaway that was really impactful, I thought, was that the corporate commitment to diversity and inclusion absolutely has to cascade down throughout the company. Because a leader with vision is great, and that's usually how these programs start. A leader with vision who's committed, who dedicates the resources, who hires the right people. But if that individual takes another opportunity at a different company or retires, it's easy to see all those efforts sort of go by the wayside if you haven't been able to win the hearts and minds of all those at various levels throughout the company, so that even when that top leader with the commitment moves to another opportunity, the company as a whole is still running ahead and moving ahead with the mission. And the data speaks for itself about the benefits to companies that are more inclusive and have more diverse workforces. But the data, having that data and knowing that data is different than the people who are making the hiring decisions, understanding why this is such an important aspect of putting together or pulling together a team that will be competitive and will be stronger as compared to the other companies out there that they're competing against. So that was a second really impressive takeaway. But I can't emphasize enough how much we appreciated the openness and the information sharing that came from the companies that participated, and I'm very excited about the opportunity to pursue discussions with some other companies.
Thank you, Kathleen. And If I might move to my right, Marita, did you have anything that you'd like to share?
Yes, first, Marita Coley, MMTC, I would like to thank the FCC and Chairman Pai for enabling a working group that is basically in an area that is not really within the FCC's jurisdiction. One of the reasons I was really excited about doing this is because back when I first started MMTC, we were engaged with National Urban League and several other civil rights groups in attempting to do this very thing, to have the tech industry come to the table, talk to us about their workforce issues and challenges. Back then, we didn't even have any data on what things were, but there was this general feeling that it was there were some issues there. And we were not successful in getting this information. In fact, frankly, it wasn't until Reverend Jesse Jackson of the Rainbow Push Group purchased stock in the companies and showed up at or threatened to show up at their shareholders meeting that they would even talk to us. So this, for me, is just a huge step forward, being empowered by the FCC in order to have the company, given the credibility to be able to have the companies come to the table and talk about the issues that we now know, it's the elephant in the room types of issues. Second, I'd like to commend the companies that came, because the fact that Apple, Google, Facebook, Twitter, and Uber came voluntarily to talk to our working group about these issues speaks volumes. And I think just in terms of the second round, we had some scheduling issues with getting everybody the first round. So there will be a second round of interviews. But that, I think, will speak volumes for getting the next round of interviews. Just in terms of takeaway for me, it was a really exciting experience to be part of, and to see what happens when you have an industry that grows so quickly that there's real, and it's virtually unregulated, that it grows so quickly that there have not been some of the basic infrastructure put in the areas of workforce, hiring, diversity. They're just not there. And so I think this industry is in the process of going back and shoring up and putting in some pillars, some basic foundational pillars that particularly, on the hiring workforce side, as we all know, on the privacy and algorithm discrimination side, hopefully on the access to capital side, because one of the things that we've addressed at MMTC throughout the years is the lack of access to capital, and the fact that only certain people, what we call pattern matching, or what's called pattern matching in this industry, that only certain entrepreneurs are going to get funded because they have to check off certain boxes and basically fit a model that has worked before. Read that, Mark Zuckerberg, with someone with Mark Zuckerberg's background, would be more likely to get funded. So hopefully this is another part of what we're going to talk to the industry about on the second round. But just in general, I thought it was great. I thought it was, great for the FCC to allow us to have this opportunity. I picked up a couple of things. One is that there are a lot of lateral hires that are going on in this industry. We're calling it poaching. So a lot of the people, the companies represented in this room, we've seen that there is a lot of lateral hiring and of talent from the telecom industry largely. And what we'd like to talk about is getting involved earlier in workforce issues, starting with STEM, starting with, middle school, starting with, I'm an apprenticeship person, starting with apprenticeships and getting more diversity earlier on and contributing to that part of diversity in the industry by hiring people who are, right out of school or getting involved at the STEM level. Then the other thing was, and also the whole thing with the companies hiring a lot of people outside of the U.S. and getting involved in some of these programs, such as apprenticeship, where you're upskilling people in the U.S. and helping them to be able to take advantage of the jobs of the future, actually the jobs of the present in this situation. And then one of the other things that struck me is last week it was National Apprenticeship Week, and I heard some presentations from the UK, Switzerland, and Canada dealing with the same kinds of issues, upskilling issues, the lack of STEM education, and all those kind of issues. And I was struck by the fact that they're way ahead. A lot of countries are way ahead of the U.S. Just in terms of having dealt with these problems, at the front end, because they are problems that the problems of lack of inclusion, I guess, become very obvious at some point. And just wanting to see these industries come to the table, step up early in the process to make their contribution to diversity in hiring and the upskilling piece. And I think that was pretty much all I had. But just in summary, it was a wonderful experience. I thank you, Gavin, for leading it, and Kathleen. And I think we're going to do, in this next round of interviews, be able to focus in and drill down on some of the issues. The bottom line is that I think that developing a best practices guide, or helping them to develop a best practices guide, will benefit all of us tremendously.
Thank you. Vaughn, did you have any comments you'd like to add?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the other members of our working group. I think from our perspective, it was very significant that the companies that we had conversation with were inclined to share information about their companies in a very straightforward and forthcoming way. And I think that was primarily because we did not approach this with a long questionnaire where we were asking the companies to fill out information that would then become privileged information in terms of their organizations, but rather our members asked questions that we had thought about, but we did not record their responses or disseminated their responses in a way that would cause these companies to be concerned about protecting their privileged information. I mean, clearly you can understand that companies that we interviewed are very competitive. They have data about how they run operations that they certainly do not want to be shared with others. And so our task was to be sure that we insisted among ourselves and reassure them that their data would be held in confidence. And I think to that extent, they were willing to share data with us. The significant thing about our first round was that we're talking about primary source data collection, which is quite different than doing academic research and looking at policy papers that I know Dr. Lee is so proficient in doing. But our sources were primary source data, which is always the most difficult data to protect, and at the same time, it's the most difficult data to collect because people generally don't want to share that kind of information. So kudos to the group who went out to California to talk with these companies, because we obviously convinced them that sharing this data with us would be, one, in their best interest, that our committee would use it in a very judicious kind of way, and that the FCC would benefit from whatever conclusions and recommendations we came up with. But I think going forward, and the chair will address this momentarily about our research approach going forward, because clearly we need to look at empirical data, what's being written in this field, what other organizations are doing here, what academics are looking at, and do a real granular assessment of what's out there. And there's a plethora of data and periodicals and other secondary source information for us to lean on. So going forward, we'll begin to look at that, and that information will serve also as an underpin for the information that we already gathered from our primary source data operations. So with that said, I think we're on the right path here. We're a long ways from getting to the end game. But I think the fact of the matter that we are dealing with a very sensitive set of data probably has not allowed us to drive this proposition as quickly as we would have loved to. Chairman?
Thank you.
Hi, yes. First of all, thank you very much to the members of the ACDDE and the working group, I think, and the FCC. I think this is tremendous, and I think that it has consequences as this industry has the potential to fundamentally transform how we communicate and how we operate generally. I think my 3 key takeaways were a couple of meta messages. The first at the 50,000-foot level is that this industry historically arose from an engineering background, and engineering is historically transactional in nature. Diversity and inclusion is relational in nature. So one of the big strategic frameworks that we have to address is how do you get inherently transactional cultures in terms of cultural adjustment to start to move on a more relational paradigm. And that's a big picture that I think the entire industry is going to need to address. Second, and related to that, is the fact that this industry is moving away from the purely engineering background that it had. So it's matching up information and opportunities with the workforce currently in place. So many people from underrepresented populations still look at the technology industry as being solely about engineering and not about other opportunities, whether it's infrastructure opportunities, legal, compliance, strategy and planning, data analytics, et cetera. So breaking that paradigm in terms of what a technologist is and what a technologist looks like. And the third main takeaway is, and I think dovetailing with the comments from the earlier working group, expanding within tech the discussion from diversity and inclusion to diversity, inclusion, and equity. Because all too often in this space, diversity and inclusion is about casting a wider net in the same very narrow pool. Without changing the parameters of that pool, you don't touch on some of the very important issues of equity that we've talked about today. So expanding the colleges that you recruit from doesn't address the portion of the U.S. population that doesn't go to college, or that doesn't go to colleges that these companies are recruiting for. It doesn't address issues such as social mobility, which cut across underrepresented populations. So I think that not only are we focused on the empirical data, but I think that we emerged with a very interesting paradigm for assessing that data.
Thank you, Monica. And Cindy, did you want to provide any comments or insights?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman, and kudos to the wonderful work of my fellow working group members. It's a great experience, being together with my fellow members and working on this project. I truly want to thank all the participating companies who take their time and make the efforts to share their insight. Personally, I learned a lot during the process. And one thing I want to mention, beside all those wonderful insights and takeaways, we look at the past and the current of D&I, diversity and inclusion. And one thing maybe we can just look into the future, because we all know we're living in a rapid evolving time of the history. And we see so many advances in technology, Internet of Things, also AI, that will definitely help to shape the future and today's and the future workforce. So I feel we can expect in the future, in this space, D&I need to probably be redefined and also updated to just accommodate the future change. So in the future, when we interview the future companies, hopefully we can also ask some of their insights about the future, their a future trend, how they want to incorporate those. Thank you.
So, as you all can see, the roundtables themselves were a unique experience in that we got to hear some very granular and in-depth, as well as overarching comments and approaches to the issue of diversity and inclusion, and I think more importantly, get a better understanding of how the challenges and the hopes are perceived by these companies. So I'm looking forward as we move forward to meeting with more companies and continue to pursue and provide the recommendation. And that is, in fact, my biggest takeaway was the companies that we met with were very interested in learning and seeing what this working group comes up with, because I was not expecting to be meeting with folks who are so eager to solve this issue. To be honest, I was expecting a little more trepidation, a little more hesitation, and they all frankly dove in. Some of them went through great length to make sure that they could participate. Some of the folks literally flew in to make sure that they could participate. And so I think that was very encouraging to me, and I'm hoping that their example encourages others as we move forward to really truly address the issues head on and in an open and honest and frankly candid way, because we all understand that there are challenges, and I mean all of us here in this committee understand that we're not getting the results that we're looking for. So getting beyond that simple fact, I think this first roundtable will have gone a long way. And finally, in closing, I would be remiss if I did not thank those of the working group. They spent a lot of time and effort, particularly given the fact that I think we did something a little unique and that we left campus, so to speak. Bringing the committee out to the West Coast is something that I don't know has often been done. And I think I was grateful for the commission for allowing us to do that, because I think it sends a different message that we're looking for solutions and a way to work together to solve this issue. And the seat that I sit in with the National Urban League, we have come to understand that there is no one person in charge of these issues. So the ability for this committee working group to extend and meet folks on their terms and where they are, I think goes a long way. And to that end, I thank Chairwoman and Ms. Beth Johnson for the support and help that they've particularly given in making sure that we keep all of our I's dotted and our T's crossed, and we continue to make progress. So thank the two of you as well. And with that, that is our report. And if there are any other questions, we'd be more than happy.
I would just like to comment on what took place that day, because both Jamila and Brenda and I had the privilege of sitting all day. It was a long day on the phone, but we had the privilege of spending the day on the phone while that was going on. And I was struck by several things, which was that we had taken it to them, which I also think was really an important piece of this, that we had gone to where they are. So if we were seeking the information, we went to the place where the information could be gotten. The second thing was that besides all the things they had said, the different way each one of these organizations was addressing the issue of diversity and inclusion varied greatly. And where they were putting their emphasis varied greatly, and how they were getting to it varied greatly. So I was struck by the fact that you have 5 tech companies all in the same general area who you would think might be doing similar things. What I was struck by is how many different things they were doing. And it seemed as I won't say an observer because I was listening, but as someone who listened intently for a very long time, what was interesting to me is it felt it was being driven by the people who were in the positions that had it. So their expertise, their history, their knowledge was really what was deciding, developing, and creating the way that each company addressed it. So it became even more important in the tech space, it seemed, for who it was driving the bus, if you will, which was something that was a little different in a lot of the places we've been, a lot of the companies we've talked to. So I thought that was also very interesting about what had happened with that. Are there questions for Gavin or the group?
I do have comments.
Susan, please.
I have experience working. Is it on?
Is it on?
I've experienced working for these companies, and I think having the FCC brand helps. The fact that you go there helps. I think living in this fast-growing digital world helps. I think the corporation all are struggling, trying to find their own place to become the most competitive competitor in the industry helps. I think the Urban League's brand helps. But I can tell you from my experience working with all these companies, they have no idea what they're doing. About a year ago, the 100 CEOs in CEOs came together, signed the 100 CEO pledge, because it all started with some discrimination scandal in Silicon Valley. I don't want to mention the company, but it's the corporation, particularly those who are in the West Coast, the Silicon Valley, which thinks it is a country of its own, doesn't need anybody else, now feels that Washington, D.C. means something to them. So that's why I think you're getting that. Indeed, you're right. This initiative, diversity, is driven by people who got the job. I've been talking to every single one of them here in Washington, D.C. when they come to my conferences. They're trying to figure out what they should do. I think the proof is in the pudding. Whether they really, the second round table, the third and fourth, will continue with the type of passion or interest, or they bring some more to the table. Yes, absolutely, they're going to tell you that these are all proprietary information, but not everything is proprietary. It's just the reason why they do not want to show their weaknesses. I think that with all this happening, they will be a big player. We need to bring them to the table. So I don't want to overextend my welcome. I want to say this. There's a lot of things to be done with these tech companies. They are anxious. They do not have a program yet. They're trying to find their level, their level on the water table, and find a comfort level. They will all have to work together in the same way. The reason why they are like the Tower of Babel is because they are not talking to each other. They're trying to find a way to deal with the diversity inclusion, and they do need workers. Here with the economy the way it is, I have some members who are saying that we're trying to automate as much as we could because we need to free our workforce to do things which only human beings do. So that's my insight with working with these companies.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else that has a question? Yes, Nicole?
So I want to commend the committee on going outside of the Beltway, and I want to commend the tech companies that participated in the dialogue, and it appears that it was a good first step, and look forward to the second iteration of findings. So I want to pick up on Monica's comment, though, in terms of how do we look at this with regards to this committee and make sure that we're not going down a narrow pathway that will give us the same old results. And it sounds like since there are disparate attempts to handle what has traditionally been considered diversity and inclusion for most corporations, that it would be interesting for the committee to sort of pursue, I think, again, going off of Monica's statement, a couple of things. I think on the diversity inclusion space, much of the conversation there has been around human resources and very relational. And so I think that there is this opportunity to sort of help companies think about how to widen the tent so that the universe of who they go for or the types of talents and skills that they are pursuing can be expanded, particularly when you deal with underrepresented communities where the educational trajectory or for whatever reason, the networking may not lead them on that same pathway. I also think in the diversity inclusion area, it would be interesting because I saw culture was represented, to have this conversation around what is it about tech companies that makes them very different from companies like Comcast or Verizon, who have put together these programs where they have been very successful in recruiting talent of color. I think I was at a meeting, not to make Rudy feel too special, but I heard about the diversity at Comcast in terms of senior leadership positions, for example. So I would just push this committee to have sort of like either this dashboard or this conversation around, how are you looking at D&I from expanding the tent of applicants? What qualifications are you putting up or positioning, and in what way does that sort of go against what might actually be available in the universe or the tent that you might be throwing out, right? And what's the representation among senior leadership and board of directors? And how are tech companies who, by the way, have been under a microscope for the last 5 years on this, thanks to the efforts of Rainbow Push and UL to actually address this, how far have they come? So I would say that's the first thing. But I don't think we want to stop there. I would also recommend this other piece, and Rita sort of talked about it, touched upon it, which is, does your diversity or lack thereof influence products and services that are going out into communities of color and having an unintended consequence on those communities, simply because you do not have diverse workforce? So when you start looking at the products and services that we consume, the question can become, getting these companies to understand, for example, when you're dealing with algorithmic bias and certain Photoshop apps are lightening the skin tones of darker skinned people or narrowing the jawline, a lot of that is primarily due to the fact that you have no one there to act as a check and balance in terms of the engineering team or the product development team or the decision maker in that capacity. So I would suggest, because we commonly look at D&I as a human resource function, that we push the companies to think about, where are you creating these products and services, and what level of diversity is going into those strategic decisions that have to do with markets that you're pursuing, products that are coming out, and is the company looking at the holistic version of that? When I visit a lot of these companies, the person who is handling diversity is usually of color. The people who are creating the products are not. And so I would just urge this committee to sort of have this conversation where they're mixing the two versus taking one pathway and saying, we're going to HBCUs and we're looking for candidates, without having some accountability around, we're actually looking at the way that our products and services work within segments of society. And because we have a diverse workforce, we're able to pick up on those cues that may generate a discriminatory effect. So I don't know if that's too big for this committee, but I would say as a member of this larger, broad working group, that if the results of the company are good D&I programs, I'm not satisfied because they're permeating every aspect of society. And I think the same level of accountability that we have given to other companies in terms of products and services and procurement, et cetera, we should give to them.
I think this committee as a whole could do something real big. That is, come up with a list of good questions. So when you went there, if you have those questions, that would have helped you to guide that discussion and elicit information from them. If they did not have the answer, then they could go back and say, hey, these are the questions that the community asked. We as a whole could, on all different 3 working groups, can come together and come up with not the FAQs,
Right.
but those smart questions, okay?
Right.
Questions which...
like, who's in your engineering department?
Who do you have? Why is it I always see a person of color meeting me when I go, why do you always send the community outreach person? Why don't you send the finance person to me? Why don't you send the marketing person to me? Those are, do you have somebody else who look like me? Or frame it in a nice way so that it could be an opening joke, an icebreaker. We as a whole, the committee as a whole, could come up with those questions so that we can also guide ourselves. I move this as a motion, formal motion.
And allow me to say, we would certainly welcome any questions or suggestions that you may have. And to Dr. Nicole Turner-Lee's comment, I can't say that we did get into those conversations. We did get, and particularly within the context of just understanding the bigger goal here, right? I think we were, in a long list of surprises, and without getting too detailed into the conversation, we did have folks who were telling us, like, look, this can't just be a box to check, right? And so what does that mean when you're saying this is more than just a compliance? In a lot of instances we heard, we're trying to figure out, or we're encouraging that this be a fundamental part of our every part and element part and parcel to what we do and how we do business. When we think about those products, we're not just thinking about the what, but the who and the how. How is this manifesting? How is this being marketed? Those in the entire scope. We have been having those conversations. And one of the other things that I mentioned offline was that in a lot of ways, one of the things that I learned is that particularly, hopefully we're able to extend the charter term. But one of the things that, if that were to happen, we as a committee would need to do is really work on how we get our message and the mission of this committee out. Because I think there was a lot of opportunities that frankly were missed, for example, with the supplier diversity conversation, because that was an extended conversation we had on several points. So I think we are having a lot of the conversations that you suggested, but I would agree that it's something that we can focus even more so
Can I just do a quick follow-up?
Sure,
Madam
go
Chair?
ahead, Nicole.
So I would just say one way to think about it, which is something that I've thought about at Brookings, which is there's diversity and inclusion, and then there's diversity in design. Okay, and so again, I think maybe pulling up on Susan's comments, when you go into round 2, I think it's interesting, there might be different people at the table when you're talking about diversity and inclusion, and different people when you're talking about diversity in the design and dissemination of products. That second part is of interest to certain committee members like myself, because what it also says is high tech would raise awareness around the impact, treatment, and errors associated with their products, which is very much what we have seen in the last few years and how it's affected communities of color. It's been the as people who are high consumers of these products, it's been the unintended consequences of some of those diversity and design decisions that have impacted us the most. And so again, I think it's important to have a balanced conversation while we have the eyes and ears of tech leaders who are essentially crafting and recrafting and reimagining products and services that reach out to the people that this committee needs to care about.
Susan, I want to go back, because the last thing you said was you wanted to make a motion. Can I ask you about that and say, are you comfortable, and Gavin, do you feel that you've heard the message that is coming from Susan? And Susan, do you still want to make it into a motion? I don't want to ignore the fact that you said that. So I'm coming back to you asking, are you comfortable that they've heard it? Is there something you want to propose to the group?
It is your committee, your good work. It's an idea. It just was born out of this conversation. I love it for it to be your motion from this committee, and I'll be happy to participate and contribute to this motion. The idea that you move that the entire committee, I mean, your working group, is your work. Your working group proposed that, move that this whole committee come together and formulate a list of smart questions that we can all use.
We can do that, or what I can do is ask that each of the working chair, we have the working chair now has a conversation, we have a conference call every month. So all of 3 of the working chairs have a conversation. And one of the things we talked about at the last committee meeting with all of us, a joint committee meeting, and one of the things that I think we talk about a little bit, but now I think it's upping our ante, if you will, is that we use the resources of all of our groups to help each other. And we started that conversation, but I think it's something we could actually ask them to do, to go back to their groups and just let them know about our conversation, and many of them are around this table now, and that perhaps when we have our December call, we could ask that each of the chairs comes back with a recommendation to go back to their committees and simply ask to do that. So perhaps that's something, would that be something that would be of interest to the working group chairs?
And I think in as much as Mark is not with us today, we probably should
This is Kathleen. I'm not a
discuss
chair,
this
but I
with
think
Mark.
Kathleen, can you hold on just one second? Because I'll come to you next. Jamila's just finishing a thought. Thank you.
We should.
Oh, can she turn on her microphone?
Oh.
Speaking, yeah.
we should raise this offline, I think, with Mark Morial and just bring back to him the gist of what we've been talking about and some of the discussion about products, engineering and design, disparate impact, and also those issues about seeking input from other advisory committee members on the dialogue that they're having, and see what his thoughts are, and give him an opportunity to talk to his own working group before we receive a recommendation like that.
And Ron, I think you had a comment you wanted to make?
Yeah, I think
Please.
in line with what has already been said, I think from a governance perspective, it would not be a good idea to mandate to committees that we go in certain directions, and that would apply for this committee recommending to your subcommittee as well. I think going the way that that's already been suggested would probably be a better approach. I think it'd be more amenable to what we're trying to do here, from my perspective, yeah. And may I also say, some of the suggestions that you've raised more broadly are already encapsulated in the questions that we're making already. Might need a little tweaking here and there, but I think the broad general idea is about the same, yeah.
Well, again, it reinforces what we talked about before, which is that this is a committee of a whole, and that while we each have working groups, there's nothing that prevents anyone from participating with another group's committee if you would like to. Because, Nicole, our goal is to make sure you do it with every subcommittee that's out there, so we don't want to...
Oh, I know, right? Don't exclude me from everything.
Right. Would not want to exclude you from that. And now I'd like to go to Kathleen, who was on the phone. Kathleen, would you care to comment, please?
No, my point was, I don't think it needs to be handled through a motion. I think all the suggestions are great suggestions, but I don't think a formal motion probably makes sense. And then the other challenge is we've got a certain amount of time left, and we can't boil the ocean, so we really should think about the suggestions that were made so that we get the maximum bang for our buck out of the next set of meetings.
Great. Good input. Nicole and Susan, if you'll I'm going to come back to you in a second, but I want to make sure that Janelle has something to say to us.
Yes, thank you. I'm very interested in the work of this working group because I think it has long-term potential for changing the industry in so many different ways, if not changing America, since the tech group is really influencing everything we do these days. Two thoughts. We used to call this EEO. Now, that's a little outdated, given the technology is different, but the principles are the same. And there was a very comprehensive and detailed best practices guide for the broadcast and cable industries and telecom industries in the very first advisory group. I had the pleasure of serving as a subject matter expert on that particular guide. I believe it's online. I encourage you to take a look at that because that may offer some best practices that have already been vetted through the traditional industries, which I hear are now transitioning into the tech industry. And while the technology is different, the human factors are the same. That guide also, if I'm not mistaken, addressed not just recruitment, which is critical because you've got to get people in the door. It also addressed retention. And I think retention becomes more important as these companies grow and change and develop new lines and new product lines. So I'm available to assist in any manner because I happen to write part of that guide and worked with some very smart people in this room. So let me know if we can be of some assistance to you.
Okay.
And Janelle, that was one of the first things that I did. I gave them that.
Yeah, just so you know, they got that guide.
Good, yeah.
They started with that guide.
Yeah, they did.
And we did.
So yes, Jamila made sure they knew about that guide. Here is the guide.
Yes.
You may want to look at it.
Yeah. And the issue of retention is one that we have continually brought up in depth as well. Because one of the things, as we've mentioned before, we are trying to address this holistically, and we believe that it is realistic to do so, right? But with regard to your overture, we would certainly reach out if we needed some more clarity on the previous report and any of that nature as well.
Certainly.
Are there other comments on this? Nicole and Susan, does this satisfy the things you've been bringing up? Are you comfortable with that? so that we can move forward?
You're going to speak for us.
I'm not gonna speak for us, but I'll tell you she's not. No, I think the protocol, Madam Chairwoman, to take it back to the committee leaders, as Kathleen also said on the phone, to ensure that the feedback is incorporated into the next round. I think the concern that Susan has is the extent to which something will actually happen. I think throughout this entire meeting, we all are kind of walking around with some type of fear that this committee will not be rechartered and that all this great work that has been started will not end. And I think for those of us that have been around for quite some time, that concern is a real concern. It happened when this committee was not rechartered for several years, and all the great work that started has sort of been picked back up, but now the issues have changed. So I think, again, I think the call to all of us, to even all of our groups, is to work expeditiously to actually move these issues forward. But, you know, obviously, we will trust that the committee will take the recommendations that we had and perhaps report back in a more detailed way what actually happened in those meetings, so we don't have to extrapolate what we think might have happened, given that this is something that, you know, deserves public
And just so
attention.
you know, one of the things they promised those companies was
some kind of-
anonymity of information. So one of the things I know that the committee has talked about is by having more meetings with more people, when you report back the information,
Right.
it's a better way to camouflage, if you will,
Right.
which particular company
Right.
said or brought up or addressed a particular situation. So I know that in their discussions, that's one of the
Right.
places they're going.
So as a researcher, one of the things that you can actually do is anonymize the information and just not call out, use the Chatham rules where you don't call out the companies, but you report back on the issues. Okay?
And Diane, let me just clarify this issue about rechartering. Chairman Powell initiated the idea, I believe, in 2003 for the initial diversity committee in a digital age. There's no advisory committee that is a standing committee. You are chartered at the discretion and the pleasure of the sitting chairperson of this agency. And so it was at the discretion of successive chairmen that similar diversity advisory committees were chartered or rechartered. And I think the instance that folk may be referring to was a change in administrations, and an incoming chairperson decided that he did not want to charter a new diversity advisory committee or to recharter an existing one. And so I will just say I have no indication from Michelle Carey, the bureau chief, that this advisory committee would not be rechartered. So in the absence of that, I'm not sure what the
In the absence of a
concern-
negative, it's not a guarantee of a positive,
Yeah.
but it's not that it won't happen.
Right, right.
Because we figure out how to negatively, positively say anything.
Right, so I don't want us to assume anything about.
Just for the record, that was not my concern, okay?
It's all right, Nicole had one. Your concerns, hers, we care about all the concerns, so.
She needed my support too, so she just added me to it. I do really, however, nevertheless, I still want to make sure that all the good talk here will be taken into action. And we
Fair
have
enough.
a lot of things came out of this today's meeting. And because, again, your working group is in a very important space, and it's going to affect a lot of the way we live, do business, and enjoy our lives. So it is. I feel that I told Nicole that it's not cannot be just rest on one working group. We all got to come together and help you reach out and do much work. Because ultimately, what you do will affect what we do here and the other working groups, simply because of the way.
That is the beauty of each of the working groups. The sum is always going to be greater than the parts, and that's why when we come back together, we come back as one committee. And the work of each of the working groups is vital to the success of what I think all of us are after, which is to make a difference in the communities that we serve. In whatever your way of serving that community, that we all have that same goal. So I think, thank you. We appreciate the comments and appreciate all the help. Thank you very much, Gavin. Is that
Yes.
Have you concluded, or is there more?
And with that, we will conclude our
Why,
presentation.
thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. I'd like to come back to the tabled discussion we had this morning that had to do with the recommendation that had been made. Each of you have now in front of you, in writing. Okay. Go ahead. Rudy, it was your original recommendation. You are...
It was, I think that we are to an agreement, but we still have some language that we're still considering amongst us. So
Okay.
we need some additional time.
All right. David? Is that
I think we're about
you?
3 words away from being there.
Okay.
We're up, but we
We're just, with eager anticipation, waiting those 3 words, so I thank you. So we will table that for the time being? Fine. We will continue on, thank you. We will continue on with our agenda. One of the things that we have all talked about is that we're about action and results and the things that the committee discusses actually becoming a reality. And as you recall in our meeting, our previous meeting, we reported out the incubator program, which we then sent to the commission. And the result was that an incubator program was initiated, and you have the report and order in your packets. I will spare you a recitation of that. You are all quite capable of reading that. So the incubator program has now been reported out. The commission is in the process of working out the logistics on how it gets implemented, because having it reported out is the beginning, not the end. They are working on that and the paperwork that has to be done and getting all the forms through the commission's general counsel office, et cetera. But toward that end, on October 30th, you were all made aware, and hopefully you had people participate in the webinar that the commission had that was providing information on how to participate in the incubator program. And so we are keeping it moving, and it is continuing to move forward. So I wanted to make sure that we all could point to something that this body had recommended and what came back from it. So I would ask you to take a few minutes and read through this and see what has come back from the commission as a whole. So, thank you. And I'd like to move on to the Broadcast Diversity and Development Group. And Henry, would you like to speak to the group, please?
Yes, ma'am. Report will be very brief, and that's because basically we've been recovering after drafting those comments for the incubator proceeding. But, and we have also been awaiting some specific guidance from the chairman's office as to what project or projects he would like us to undertake. That direction was forthcoming late last week, so we now have some rather specific guidance as to what he wants us to do. I've discussed that with Diane. She's going to try to put a little finer point on those directions, and we will then be undertaking that project in the coming months, and hopefully we will be able to get it completed prior to the expiration of this advisory committee's life or its notification that it's been rechartered. So it's my understanding that we expire, as I said earlier this morning, on June 30, and hopefully we'll hear before that whether we will be rechartered. So stay tuned. We'll be, you'll be hearing from us in the near future, I hope, on this project, and should be an interesting one. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. Any questions? Because the information has been very recently coming to Henry from the chairman, the parameters for it are being outlined, and Henry has made some comments back today, and Jamila and I will take those back to the chairman's office and get their their direction on that, but thank you for that, Henry. And then I'm sure they will have more to report for us. One of the things we tried to do, given how tough it is to get this room, is we tried to set our schedule for our meetings and our calls going forward. So as you should all know now, May 20th of next year, talk about getting lots of notice. May 20th will be our final in-person meeting under this particular charter. So that will be our next meeting for the commission, the working group as a whole, excuse me, the subcommittee as a whole, the diversity committee. And we will, obviously, each of the groups will be working on their activities before that and during that. And as I say, we have set up monthly calls with the three chairs. So let's make sure that we use the discussion that we had today and the offers of help and resources that each of us have with the other to make sure that we're communicating that. And then our next call will be December 12th is our next scheduled call. So I would ask each of the subgroup chairs if you would make sure you have some conversation with your various working groups about some of the things that have come out of this meeting, some of the things we've learned, some of the things we've shared. And if there are suggestions for questions, Susan, Nicole, Janelle, everyone who's offered to participate, that would be great. And if there are suggestions for the other working groups, let's make sure that we're not working in a silo so much as we're reaching across the table and making use of all the great resources that we have here at the moment. Do we have any comments from the public? Is there anyone from the public that would care to make a comment? With that thunderous crowd? Is there any other business that the working group would like to discuss? Is there anything you would like to bring to the table?
Diane, can you clarify what we're going to do with this transmittal language? That's a little unclear to me.
Well, I was going to ask Rudy. He transitioned. Yeah, so while we're waiting for Rudy to come back, it gives me a moment to just say how really impressed I am with the work that you have done and the privilege for me to be able to participate in it to whatever level with you. You've heard today the work that has been done by each of the individuals on this group as well as the committees themselves. And your time and energy, and I know Heather has those meetings and you better be on the phone, and Gavin has those meetings and he's waiting. Get to the call, get to the call. But the fact is, you're doing great work. You're doing things that hopefully we all, because we do this so that we can make a difference. We do this so that when we're done, hopefully we can look back and say, we were part of helping to make that happen. I think that's why we're all here. I think Nicole and Susan and all of us who have been doing this for a while will look around and say, we've talked a lot. We'd like to hope we have action that moves the needle. So I cannot thank you enough for your efforts. And I thank Brenda and Jamila for us keeping you really busy and on a lot of calls and spending your days with us. But we appreciate that and helping us to get done what we need to do. It's I think, important work, and I thank you all for that. And I know many of you come to these meetings. It's not an easy thing to do, so it is appreciated. Thank you. And let's see if we have, we have language? Do we have Rudy?
We've been keeping drafts back and forth, and he just sent a couple options, and one of them, that helps. Rudy and I have been multitasking, sending language back and forth, and we now have language that we both agree does work. This would go in the transmittal. It would say, and I'll read it slowly so you can take it down, these recommendations should not be construed as intending to address or impact.
All right, well, one moment, please. To address, so that's the first change.
Or impact the merits of any FCC initiatives.
Period?
Period. And of course, what that, the initiatives that we've been discussing, of course, are, as you know, are broad recruitment.
Well, now I'm confused. I thought we started off trying to remain, to contain the status quo ante of litigation.
That's right.
And now this
But
language
no, but
goes
we
to
don't need
FCC
mention
initiatives.
But we don't need to mention litigation or get involved in, 'cause in a court case, even implicitly. But what this does is avoid that by just saying that whether it's involved in litigation or not, it's not intending to imply that there is some nexus between these workshops and the other way that the commission engages with this issue of procurement. And that's a clean way of accomplishing this. Rudy thinks it works, I think it works, and we've sort of figured it out.
Okay.
It's a graceful way of doing it with the least
If I
possible
misunderstood you,
impact.
please clarify. I thought you said that NABOB and MMTC had filed suit.
Right, we're in court, that's right, but this is a way of not immersing the advisory committee even inferentially in the court case while still making the point that doing workshops and broad recruitment are not intended to implicate each other. So it's a graceful way of just making that point.
Would you repeat it one more time?
Let me repeat it again. These recommendations should not be construed as intending to address or impact the merits of any FCC initiatives.
Did everyone on the phone have an opportunity to hear that? Maybe?
Yep.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to make sure that we were giving you a chance to hear this, because we've been working through this for a while, so I wanted to make sure. So if I can read it again, and please let me know if I'm reading it accurately.
Sure.
These recommendations should not be construed as intending to address or impact the merits of any FCC initiatives.
Yeah.
Okay.
And also move.
Can I ask, because I'm not totally clear, what do we think this gets us, is my question at the moment.
I think what it does is it avoids the possibility that either in the public sphere or in the litigation, the commission would somehow say, the diversity committee says that by holding a workshop or having a portal, that there's no need to have rules relating to broad recruitment. We would not be put in that awkward and incorrect position.
Does this discourage the commission from adopting your recommendation?
No.
No?
Does it discourage the, no, it just says you can't, it can't misconstrue
Your intent, the
right.
advisory committee's intent.
Right, it can't waive the advisory committee. The advisory committee voted for this, so we
Okay.
don't need to do broad recruitment. It wouldn't misconstrue what the advisory committee unanimously did today. And that's all it needs to accomplish.
All right, is someone, are you or Rudy making this?
Yeah, I've made the motion. Rudy, it's option number 1. I've just moved it. Hmm?
Are you making this recommendation, Rudy?
I think Dave is making the amendment.
Yeah, I just moved.
Well, actually, this isn't, we don't have one on the floor at the moment. I mean, we've tabled the one we had, so are we replacing this, and who's making it, is what I'm asking.
Oh, I'll make it, and
Okay,
Rudy, in the email you just sent me with number 1 and number 2, number 1, and I just read it and moved it. It just needs a second.
All right, so just to be sure, because you weren't in the room, so I think maybe you need to hear this.
Is there number 2 then?
Number 1.
Rudy, how many did you
He hasn't seen
decide?
Oh, we have actually, Dave has moved 1, and that's the 1.
Okay. These recommendations should not be construed as intending to address or impact the merits of any FCC initiatives. All right. David has moved that. Is there a second?
Second.
Henry has seconded. Discussion. Do we have discussion? Yes, Janelle.
Given the word any, should initiatives be singular? It should be singular. Any FCC initiative.
Either one.
And question, I'm just asking the question, do we include rulemaking and formal proceedings as an initiative?
Sure. That's a rule.
Yeah.
That's an FCC initiative.
Okay.
Well, that was my concern, that
Okay.
it was pretty sweeping. Yes.
All right.
That's okay.
Is there any other discussion?
Just a point of clarification, and David Baker working on this. The understanding is that this would be language that would be included in transmittal communication from the committee to the commission. And I imagine subsequent communications as well, not necessarily in the body of the recommendation which the committee. Sorry. Sorry about that. Yeah, no, my understanding is that this language is language that would be included in any transmittal of the recommendation, which was already voted upon from the committee to the FCC. So the recommendation as voted upon, that's settled. This is language that we would include in any transmittal or any subsequent.
That's correct. Yes.
Well, the chair of the advisory committee transmits the adopted recommendations of the advisory committee. So you're talking about her correspondence to Chairman Ajit Pai.
In other words, it shows the spirit of the sentiment, but not embedded in the recommendation, which
That's
is a
correct.
formal document.
That's correct. Should we call the question? Or,
Question.
I'm sorry,
I'll call the
please.
question.
All right, we'll call the question. All those in favor of adding this as language for transmittal to the chairman's office, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Aye. All right, we will do that. Is there any other business to be brought before the committee? Then I thank you all. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving, and we will see you in May, and I'll talk before that. Thank you.